Hello everyone, I'm the Creeps Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I remember the first time I realized how alone you could really be in the wilderness. It wasn't a sudden terror, more a creeping, relentless awareness that the world I trusted so implicitly had quietly shifted. I had decided to take a weekend trip alone, just me and my gear, deep into a stretch of forest I had scouted months before. It wasn't some dramatic or famous national park. It was just a stretch of dense, unkempt woods with uneven trails, hidden creeks, and patches of old farmland that no one maintained anymore. The kind of place where you could easily get lost without anyone noticing. I had arrived mid-afternoon, driving down a narrow dirt road that gradually narrowed into a barely there track between trees. The car kicked up dust and small stones, but no other vehicles passed me, no distant voices, nothing. I parked near a clearing I had marked on my map as suitable for camping, with enough space for a tent and a small fire. The forest was dense, trees rising straight and close, their canopies thick enough to cast most of the forest floor into shadow even in bright daylight. There were birds and insects, of course, but something about the way they sounded felt different than usual. Less like a normal forest and more like a boundary between what I knew and what was untamed. I set up my tent, carefully staking it, arranging my backpack and supplies, lighting a small camp stove to make some food. As the sun dropped lower, I wandered slightly into the tree-line, just a few dozen meters, to gather firewood. That was when I first noticed how quiet the forest really could get. Not the usual quiet that makes you feel calm or peaceful, but a hollow silence, as if the world had pressed pause on everything but itself. My steps on the dry leaves made sharp, crackling noises, echoing in ways that didn't make sense in such a thick forest. By the time I returned to the tent, the sky had turned a bruised purple, stars starting to prick through the thinning light. I lit a small fire in the pit I had dug earlier and sat close to it, watching sparks float into the air, listening to the night settle around me. I felt safe, at least at first. Safe until the sound started. It was subtle at first, almost like a whisper, a faint scraping or dragging sound somewhere beyond the ring of light from my fire. I froze, listening, thinking it was maybe just the wind or a fallen branch moving. But then I heard it again, slower this time, deliberate, consistent. Footsteps, maybe, or something being dragged. Not loud, but close enough to make my skin tighten. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the tree-line, the beam cutting through the darkness but revealing nothing. I convinced myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, something small and curious. I tried to ignore it, telling myself my imagination was feeding off the shadows. I stayed up later than I normally would, keeping the fire going, feeding it wood to maintain a bright circle of light around me. The sounds stopped eventually, or at least they faded into the usual night noises of crickets and distant calls of owls. I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted and tense, hoping sleep would come quickly. It didn't. I woke hours later to the sound of breathing. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Outside the tent, just beyond the thin nylon wall. My heart slammed in my chest, and I stayed as still as I could, listening. The breathing continued for long moments, punctuated by soft rustles, subtle movements like something brushing against undergrowth. I didn't dare move or shine my light. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, but the sound, it didn't feel right. Too heavy, too intentional. And the moment I thought about unzipping the tent and looking, it stopped. Just like that. Morning didn't bring relief. The sun struggled to break through a dense layer of clouds, casting the forest in muted gray light. I ate a quick breakfast, packing up most of my gear, but I kept my knife close, tucked in my hand. My plan was simple: hike back to my car along the trail I had mapped. But as I started walking, the forest seemed wrong. The trail forked differently than I remembered. Trees that should have been on my left were now on my right. Dead leaves and branches that I had marked as landmarks were gone or displaced. The forest had shifted overnight, subtly, unnaturally. Panic started to creep in, a cold weight that pressed against my chest. I retraced my steps, trying to remember the turns I had taken, the landmarks, the small rock formations I had noted. But every time I thought I recognized something, the path bent in another direction. I could feel it. I was being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves, made me freeze, convinced something was moving just beyond my sight, keeping pace. Hours passed. I walked, doubled back, and tried to climb small rises for better vantage points, but the forest never opened up. There were no distant sounds of traffic, no birds, nothing human. Only the subtle, intermittent noises that suggested I wasn't alone. I thought about calling for help, but my phone had no signal, of course, and the battery was already low. I realized the isolation I had underestimated, the raw vulnerability of being completely alone in a vast, indifferent wilderness. As the day wore on, I noticed signs, broken branches, faint footprints in soft soil, the occasional dragged line across dead leaves. They weren't fresh enough to be immediate, but recent enough to confirm my suspicions. Something, or someone, had been moving through this part of the forest. I didn't know what, and I didn't want to know. I made a decision to keep moving west, guessing the road would eventually appear. Sunlight was fading again, clouds thickening. Shadows crept across the forest floor in ways that made me second-guess every direction. My mind raced with every worst-case scenario, every encounter I had heard about in documentaries or survival stories. I clutched my knife and a small flashlight, listening for breathing, any sound that would give away an approach. Just when I felt the panic cresting, I saw it, a faint line of tire tracks, almost hidden beneath leaves and dirt, leading toward a narrow clearing. Relief washed over me in small, trembling waves. I followed them, stepping carefully, listening for anything unusual. The clearing opened to a stretch of abandoned farmland, overgrown but recognizable. And then finally I saw it. The old dirt road, the same one I had driven in on, winding through the forest. My legs felt like they would collapse, but I ran, ignoring the pain, following the path I knew. I reached my car as the last light of day faded, the forest behind me dark and silent. I locked the doors, slid into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The noise was a comfort, the vibrations beneath me tangible proof that I was back in the world I knew. I drove slowly at first, then faster as I put distance between myself and the forest, heart still hammering, eyes darting to the shadows that lined the road. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over, letting my hands shake, taking deep breaths. The reality of what had happened hit me. I had underestimated the wilderness, underestimated isolation, and overestimated my own preparedness. I realized how quickly the sense of control we take for granted could vanish, how thin the line between safe adventure and danger could be. I didn't go back into those woods. I didn't even drive near that area again for years. But I carried the memory, the awareness that solitude in the forest can become something much more than peaceful reflection. It can become a test of endurance, a confrontation with fear itself, and a reminder that even when nothing seems to threaten you directly, the unknown can be enough. I told myself stories afterward to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was another hiker. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe the forest had just shifted in ways my memory didn't account for. But deep down, I knew better. Something had been there, moving in the shadows, patient and unseen, and I had only escaped because I hadn't stopped moving, because I had trusted my instincts when every rational part of me wanted to believe I was safe. Years later, I still remember that night. Every rustle in the wind, every snap of a branch, triggers a flash of that hollow, tense awareness. I never camped alone in unknown forests again. And every time I drive past areas with thick tree leans, I can't help but glance toward them, wondering what might be moving just out of sight, waiting for the unwary. That trip taught me more than survival skills. It taught me caution, respect, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what you see in the dark, but what you don't see. The memory lingers, not like a dream, but like a mark you carry with you. A reminder that real fear doesn't need ghosts or shadows. It's quiet, patient, and alive in the spaces where the world still refuses to be predictable. It's the silence between the sounds, the pause before the next step, the knowledge that you are small, alone, and entirely at the mercy of forces you cannot control. And the clarity that comes afterward, the relief, the light, the roads and cars and voices, is the only reward for having survived it. I remember the first time I felt truly alone in the woods. I had gone on a solo camping trip in the late summer, wanting to escape everything for a few days. The air was dry and hot during the day, the kind of heat that makes the skin feel tight and sticky, but at night it cooled sharply, the temperature dropping almost 20 degrees. I had planned everything carefully, or at least I thought I had. My backpack was stuffed with essentials: food, water, a sleeping bag, a tent, a small first aid kit, and my flashlight. I had a map, but I had mostly relied on my memory and a rough sketch I had made of the area after studying satellite images online. I set up my tent near a small clearing about a half-mile into the forest, where the trees thinned out enough for the sunlight to reach the ground. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and pine needles, and the smell of damp earth was strong. I spent the afternoon walking along a narrow trail, taking in the quiet of the forest, which wasn't truly silent. There were birds and insects, rustling leaves, the occasional snap of a twig. But compared to the city, it was deafening in its stillness. As evening approached, the sun sank behind the treetops, and the shadows stretched long across the forest floor. I lit a small fire in a cleared area near my tent, cooking a simple meal over the flames. The firelight danced across the trees, making their shapes waver and sway in a way that was mesmerizing and slightly unsettling. I felt a strange mix of comfort and unease, the kind that comes from being completely removed from human presence, yet acutely aware that the forest could hide things I couldn't see. After dinner, I decided to explore a bit further along the trail. My flashlight cut through the dark in a narrow cone of light, illuminating roots and rocks, but leaving most of the forest in a thick black void. Every sound was amplified in the silence: the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant cry of an owl. I felt exposed and alert, like a small animal aware that predators might be watching. I wandered further than I intended, and soon I realized I had lost the sense of direction I had been relying on. The trail twisted in ways that didn't match my mental map. I stopped to get my bearings, scanning the forest with my flashlight. The trees looked almost identical in every direction, their trunks straight and dark, the canopy above blocking out what little moonlight had begun to appear. I felt the first stirrings of panic, a tightening in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew that panic would make me lose control. I decided to backtrack, but as I turned, I noticed something odd. A faint glint of movement among the trees caught the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was a deer, but the movement was deliberate and slow, almost cautious, as if whoever, or whatever, it was knew I was there. I froze, holding my breath, straining to see through the darkness. My flashlight trembled slightly in my hand, and for a moment, I considered running back to the tent, but something rooted me to the spot. The movement stopped. I shone my light toward where I had seen it, sweeping slowly through the dense underbrush. Nothing. The forest seemed normal again, only the sound of leaves rustling in the night wind. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a fox, and tried to reason it away, but the unease stayed, settling in my stomach like a stone. I decided to return to the tent, moving carefully along the trail, my flashlight casting long shadows that danced around me. As I walked, I kept thinking I heard something behind me, a faint crunch of leaves, a whisper of movement. Every time I stopped and turned, nothing was there. My heart pounded, and I began to notice the small details. The way the shadows seemed to shift even when the trees didn't. The way the wind moved through the branches in a strange pattern, as if it was following me. When I finally reached the clearing where I had set up camp, relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. My fire had almost burned out, leaving a small bed of glowing embers. I knelt to revive it, shaking my hands from the cold that had crept in. As I fed the fire, I noticed tracks in the soft dirt around the clearing, large, heavier than human footprints, spaced in a way that suggested slow movement around the perimeter. My mind raced. I had seen deer tracks before, but these were nothing like that. They were uneven, some deeper than others, as if someone, or something, was moving carefully, testing the ground. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the edges of the clearing, my pulse hammering in my ears. The forest beyond was black, unbroken except for the occasional faint outline of a tree trunk. I tried to reason it out. Maybe it was a wild animal, maybe a bear, but my experience with wildlife told me the tracks didn't match any animal I knew. And bears don't move around quietly, testing the ground. My stomach churned. I decided not to sleep, at least not fully. I built the fire higher, adding dry branches, and sat close to it, keeping my flashlight ready. Hours passed in tense vigilance. I heard more noises, twigs snapping, leaves brushing together, the occasional distant howl or call that didn't seem like any animal I recognized. I stayed in the glow of the fire, watching the darkness beyond it, my senses hyper-alert. Every shadow, every sound made me flinch. Around midnight, the sounds changed. The movement became more deliberate, closer, circling the clearing. I could hear heavy breathing now, slow and measured, accompanied by the soft padding of feet on the forest floor. The hairs on my neck stood on end. I considered running, but I knew that leaving the fire would give whatever it was an advantage. I stayed low, keeping the fire between myself and the forest, listening, trying to understand. Hours passed like this. I didn't move, didn't make a sound. My food and water lay untouched, my body tensed for the slightest signal. The first light of dawn was my only hope of seeing what had been circling me. When the forest finally began to lighten, I could make out shapes better, the trees, the uneven ground, and faint impressions in the dirt that showed where it had been. It hadn't left, but it had kept its distance once it realized the fire was a barrier. As the sun rose higher, I decided to move. I packed my tent, extinguished the fire carefully, and began the walk back to the main trail I had marked on my map. Every step was cautious. I scanned the edges of the clearing continuously. The tracks showed it had followed me for part of the night, then disappeared into the woods once daylight came. I never saw it clearly, but I didn't need to. The fear it inspired had been enough. I returned to my car hours later, exhausted and shaken, my heart still racing. I locked the doors and sat for a long time, staring at the forest edge. I knew what I had experienced was real, tangible, and utterly dangerous. I felt a deep respect for the forest after that, its beauty intertwined with unpredictability, its silence masking threats that were very much alive. In the following days, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went back later with a friend to look at the area in daylight, to retrace my steps. The clearing was peaceful, the forest quiet and seemingly harmless. The tracks were still visible, faint in the dirt, but they looked almost mundane in the bright sun. Seeing them in daylight changed nothing about the experience. It only reminded me how quickly things can shift when you're out there alone, and how much we take for granted in everyday safety. The trip taught me vigilance, respect for nature, and the value of preparation. I kept all my gear in order, never ventured alone again without notifying someone, and I learned to trust my instincts. The memory of that night never left me. The tension, the fear, the way the forest seemed alive with unseen eyes. But I also left with a sense of clarity. I had survived because I stayed calm, observed, and acted cautiously. The woods hadn't changed, but I had. I understood that fear wasn't just something to endure. It was a tool to navigate danger, to pay attention to what the world around you was telling you, even when it wasn't speaking in words. Years later, I still think about that night. Every time I go camping, I check my surroundings, make sure my fire is strong, and listen closely. I can't forget the feeling of being watched, the soft, calculated movement through the dark. I never saw who or what had been there, and maybe I never will. But I learned that sometimes, surviving isn't about confronting what you fear. It's about understanding it, respecting it, and making the right choices to walk away alive. The forest remains as it was, indifferent, immense, and full of hidden life. And I remain as I was that night, aware, cautious, and deeply aware of just how fragile our sense of security can be when we step outside the safety of the world we know. It started as a normal weekend trip. I had decided to get away from the city, the constant noise, the endless traffic, and the suffocating sense of routine. I packed my car with a small tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, bottled water, and a flashlight, telling myself it was going to be a simple solo camping trip. I wanted nothing more than to sit in the quiet, feel the air around the trees, hear nothing but the wind and the occasional bird. I picked a remote forested area I had driven past a few months earlier, a place so isolated that the nearest town was almost an hour away, connected only by narrow, winding dirt roads that seemed to get smaller and rougher the deeper I went. The drive itself was easy at first. The city faded behind me, and the road became quiet, lined with thick woods on either side. By the time I reached the last stretch, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the ground and turning the leaves into shades of gold and orange. The air smelled different here, cleaner and sharper, tinged with pine and damp earth. I parked my car near a small clearing I had noticed, which was just large enough for my tent and a small campfire. Setting up the tent was straightforward. I made sure the poles were tight, the stakes secure, and the entrance facing the clearing, so I could see any movement outside. I gathered firewood from fallen branches around the clearing, avoiding anything that looked too wet or soft, stacking a neat pile for later. The first night was quiet in the way that feels comforting when you've left the world behind. The kind of quiet that makes the usual sounds of your mind feel louder, the little things you notice when there's no one else around. I ate a simple dinner, canned beans and bread, and watched the sun sink below the horizon. As darkness fell completely, I lit a small fire, sitting back and listening. There was no wind, just the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. My flashlight lay on the ground beside me, and I had my phone fully charged, though I knew service would be weak or non-existent out here. I felt entirely alone, but that was exactly why I had come. The isolation was soothing. Around 11 p.m., I decided to lie down. I didn't bring a chair. The firelight was enough to warm me, and the tent was close. I crawled inside, zipped the door halfway to keep insects out, and pulled my sleeping bag over me. The fire still crackled outside, and I could hear the occasional snap of a twig in the distance. I tried not to think much about it. Forests are full of sounds at night, I reminded myself. Animals moving, branches falling, the wind. Nothing more. About an hour later, I woke with a jolt. There was a sound, faint but distinct. It wasn't animal or wind. It was closer, deliberate. Something moving through the underbrush. I froze, heart racing, listening. The sound repeated, a soft, crunching step followed by silence, then again. It wasn't random. It was pacing, moving around the edge of the clearing, circling me. I could feel my pulse in my ears. My first thought was to convince myself it was a deer or some small animal, but the steps were too heavy, too methodical. I reached for my flashlight slowly, trying not to make any noise. As soon as I turned it on, the beam cut through the dark, sweeping across the trees. Nothing moved, but the sound had stopped, leaving a silence so complete it made me feel exposed. I shined the light around the clearing again, moving slowly, scanning every shadow. Still nothing. I tried to breathe, convincing myself that this was just an overactive imagination, the mind playing tricks in the dark. Then I heard it again, this time from the side of the tent. I could hear leaves crunching, and the movement was deliberate, closer than before. Panic set in. I grabbed my small camping knife from the side pocket of the sleeping bag. I considered staying inside, but something in me knew that would make me trapped. If there was someone out there, the tent was too thin to stop them. I had to leave. Quietly, I unzipped the door completely and stepped out, knife in hand, eyes scanning. The fire had dimmed, leaving the clearing mostly in shadows. I took one step into the open, listening. The sound had stopped, but there was a faint smell that made my stomach tighten, metallic, like iron or blood. I couldn't see anything moving, but my instinct screamed that I wasn't alone. My mind raced through possibilities. A hiker, a thief, some local drunk wandering in the woods. Whoever or whatever it was, I had to act. I ran to the car. My boots crunched over dry leaves and dirt, my flashlight bouncing ahead of me. Heart hammering, I reached the car and fumbled with the keys. My hands were shaking so much that I almost dropped the knife. The metal blade glinted in the flashlight beam as I pulled the door open and threw myself inside. I locked it immediately. Sitting there, catching my breath, I listened. Nothing. Silence again. My chest ached, my palms sweaty against the steering wheel. I tried to call someone, anything, but of course, there was no service. I stayed in the car, weighing my options. It was far too late to try walking out. I considered waiting until sunrise, hoping whoever it was had left. I forced myself to take slow breaths, trying to calm down, focusing on sounds. That's when I noticed it, a shadow moving across the edge of the clearing, just past the tree line. I could make out the shape of a person, tall, moving slowly, deliberately, as if waiting. I knew then that this was no animal or lost hiker. Someone was out there, watching. My heart sank. The reality hit me. I was in a completely isolated area, someone with unknown intentions, and no way to call for help. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, clutching the knife, flashlight close by, watching that shadow. Occasionally it would pause, vanish into the dark trees, then reappear at another edge of the clearing, moving silently. Dawn was hours away, and I couldn't just sit there. I needed a plan. I remembered the main road, a narrow dirt track that led back to the paved highway. If I could reach it, I could get service and call for help. I had to wait until first light, but even then, it would be a slow, careful journey. I decided to wait, keeping the engine running, the doors locked, knife and flashlight ready. When the first light of morning filtered through the trees, I eased the car door open. I didn't move quickly. Any sudden sound would draw attention. The shadow from the night before had disappeared, but I couldn't be sure. I started down the path slowly, walking on the side of the road, staying as quiet as possible. Every step felt loud in the silence. I kept my eyes on the tree-line, every movement catching my attention. About 15 minutes into the walk, I heard it again, the crunching of leaves, slow, careful steps, moving parallel to me, but hidden in the underbrush. I froze, heart hammering. I had to make a decision. I started running, zigzagging to make it harder to predict my path. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I couldn't stop. I had to reach the highway. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the paved road. Relief washed over me, but I didn't slow down. I ran until I reached the first car, waving my arms frantically. The driver stopped, bewildered, but I didn't care. I climbed in, gave them my story in short bursts, and asked them to call the police. As the sirens arrived behind me a few minutes later, I realized that the person, or people, had vanished back into the woods, leaving nothing but footprints and broken branches. The police searched for hours. They found signs of someone camping illegally nearby, evidence of recent movement through the woods, but nothing concrete. No one was caught. I never returned to that clearing, and I never went camping alone again. The experience stayed with me. I learned that even in the quiet, even in nature, isolation can be dangerous. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unpredictable, and humans, more than anything else, are capable of silent, patient danger. That day, I survived not because I was clever or strong, but because I stayed alert, stayed quiet, and acted when I had to. The fear didn't leave me completely, but I carry it as a reminder, a sharp edge beneath calm skin. I know now how quickly normal can turn into something else entirely. And I know that silence in the woods is not always peaceful. Sometimes it's a warning. I remember the heat of that afternoon like it was pressing against my skin, heavy and relentless. I had been walking for hours along the edge of the forest, trying to find a place to set up a small campsite for the night. The sun was beginning to lean toward the west, spilling golden light across the tall grass and the edges of the pines, casting long shadows that moved like dark fingers. My backpack was heavy, loaded with water, a small stove, a few cans of food, and a sleeping bag. I hadn't planned on being in the woods alone this long, but my mind had been restless for days, and I wanted space. I wanted silence. The path I was on narrowed after a while, the dirt becoming rocky and uneven. I stumbled a few times, catching myself on tree roots that jutted out unexpectedly. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds had stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to shy away, brushing gently through the leaves, but leaving an odd emptiness in the air. That silence was the first thing that set me on edge. I shook my head, telling myself it was just the forest settling into evening. I finally found a small clearing near a bend in a stream. It was the perfect spot, I thought at first. Flat ground, a gentle slope down to the water, and enough trees around the edge to give a sense of privacy. I dropped my pack and took a long drink from my water bottle, letting my eyes wander. The light was fading faster than I expected, turning the forest a deep shade of green that almost looked black in patches. I started gathering wood for a fire, picking through fallen branches and snapping off dry twigs. As I worked, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, moving fast and low along the edge of the clearing. I froze, my heart pounding, listening. The forest didn't make the sound I thought I had heard. A soft scrape against leaves, a footstep? I blinked and shook my head, telling myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a fox. The woods had plenty of wildlife. My rational mind tried to calm the fluttering in my chest, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up anyway. I built a small fire, careful to keep it low. The flames licked the air, giving me some comfort as I unpacked my small stove and set it up on a flat rock. The forest around me seemed to settle again, but every so often, I thought I heard something, a twig snapping, a low rustle. Each sound made me tense, my senses straining in the dim light. The firelight bounced against the trees, making shapes that weren't there. I reminded myself to breathe. I cooked a simple meal, the smell of beans and bread filling the clearing. As I ate, I kept glancing toward the tree line. Shadows shifted in the corner of my vision, subtle but unmistakable. I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a raccoon or other small animal looking for scraps. The wind rustled more leaves, and a bird called once, sharp and sudden, breaking the silence. My stomach tightened. After finishing my food, I washed my small pan in the stream and laid out my sleeping bag. The fire was still burning low, giving me warmth and light, but the sun was gone now, leaving only the deep blue of twilight. I lay on my back, staring up at the treetops, trying to focus on the faint shapes of clouds and stars beginning to appear. I thought I was safe, that the forest was quiet, but then I heard it, a breathing, low and deliberate, not fast like a small animal but heavy, controlled. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the tree line, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I couldn't see anything, but the breathing continued, slow and steady. I felt my pulse spike, every instinct telling me to get up and run, but my legs were frozen. I told myself to stay calm, to assess, but my brain felt caught between disbelief and fear. I reached slowly for my flashlight, trying not to make a sound. The moment my hand touched it, the breathing stopped. I froze, every nerve on edge. After a few seconds, it started again, but now I realized it was moving. Something was circling the clearing, keeping just outside the light. I didn't know what it was, but it was big, the way the air seemed to shift as it moved. My stomach turned. I knew I had to act. Slowly, I got up, keeping my body low, trying to stay in the shadow of my fire. My pack was next to me, and I grabbed a long stick for a makeshift weapon. The breathing grew louder, closer, then faded again as whatever it was moved around the perimeter. Every step I took toward my pack felt like it was being mirrored by a presence in the dark. I managed to get my pack and flashlight. I clicked it on, scanning the edges of the clearing. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees and brush. Nothing. The forest was silent again, except for the small crackle of my dying fire. I debated running to my car, which was parked at the edge of the forest, but I knew the distance would be dangerous in the dark, and if whatever it was followed me, I'd be exposed. Instead, I decided to make noise, to assert presence. I banged the stick against a rock, then shouted loudly. The sound echoed through the trees, sharp and unnatural in the quiet night. I held my breath. After a few moments, the forest returned its silence. No sound of fleeing, no rustling, just nothing. I realized then that hiding was not helping. I gathered the rest of the wood I had collected and piled it on the fire, making it flare higher. Flames leapt, crackling and sending sparks into the air. I kept my stick ready, shining the flashlight toward every shadow. Minutes felt like hours. The breathing never returned, and finally, I allowed myself a slow exhale. As the fire burned brightly, I scanned the clearing more thoroughly. That's when I noticed the prints in the dirt, large, elongated, with claws. They circled the fire, stopping just short of it. My stomach dropped. I knew enough about wildlife to recognize them, mountain lion, one of the largest predators in these woods, and it had been watching me for some time. I stayed awake the rest of the night, the fire roaring, and my flashlight sweeping continuously. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the brush, made me tense. I kept thinking about the prints, imagining how close it had been, its eyes reflecting the firelight. I didn't sleep at all, lying in my bag with my makeshift weapon beside me, listening to the forest breathe. Dawn finally came with a pale light that crept slowly through the trees. I could see more clearly now, the forest waking, birds calling again, and the shadows retreating. The fire had burned down to embers, but I still felt its warmth and protection. I packed my things quickly, making sure nothing was left behind that could attract attention. I moved cautiously toward the edge of the clearing, checking the ground for more prints. There were a few more, but they led away from me, back toward deeper woods. I kept my stick ready, scanning constantly. By the time I reached the main path, the sun had risen fully, bright and golden, and I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I made it back to my car without incident. My hands were still shaking as I got inside, locking the doors immediately. The engine roared to life, and I drove slowly, still scanning the tree line, aware that something might still be following. But as the miles passed, the forest receded, and with it, the immediate threat. I stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, and sat for a long time, sipping coffee and staring out the window. I couldn't stop thinking about the night, about the mountain lion, about how close I had come to being in serious danger. I realized then how much I had underestimated the wilderness, how easily it could overwhelm you if you let your guard down. The experience stayed with me, a reminder of how thin the line can be between safety and danger. I learned to respect the forest in a way I hadn't before, to pay attention to every sound, every shadow. I never returned to that clearing, but I kept thinking about it, about the fire and the prints, about the way the night had pressed down on me like a living thing. Eventually, I told myself the story over and over, each telling helping me process it. I knew I had survived because of caution and patience, because I stayed awake and alert, because I made the fire and stayed visible. It was a relief, yes, but also a humbling experience. The forest was no fairy tale. It was alive, and it did not forgive mistakes. I had faced it and lived, and the memory of that night stayed with me as a silent lesson, clear and undeniable. Even now, years later, when I walk near the edge of a forest or hike alone, I remember that night. I remember the feeling of being watched, the sound of breathing in the darkness, the prints in the dirt, and the way every instinct screamed to run or hide. It taught me vigilance, respect, and the clarity that comes with surviving something that could have ended everything in a heartbeat. I carry that lesson with me, and I always will. I remember the first time I realized how alone you could feel in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't a sudden moment or a single frightening event at first. It was a slow accumulation of small, unsettling things that eventually pressed down on me so heavily I felt my chest tighten and my heart hammering in a rhythm I couldn't control. I had decided to go camping alone, wanting a weekend away from the city, from people, from the constant noise and obligations. I thought it would be peaceful, restorative, maybe even a little thrilling in a controlled way. What I didn't realize was how quickly the forest could shift from calming to dangerous, from beautiful to terrifying. I drove for hours along winding roads until the asphalt ran out and the landscape opened up into a gravel path that seemed to stretch endlessly. On either side of me were dense trees, the type that bent and twisted in strange angles, their leaves thick enough to swallow light. I could feel the air changing, the scent of gasoline and city grime fading into damp earth and pine. The last sign of civilization was a small wooden marker warning of private property and hunting seasons. Beyond that, it was just me and the forest. I parked near a clearing that looked perfect for a tent. It was flat, surrounded by trees that created a natural barrier from wind, and I could see a small stream winding through the undergrowth not far away. I set up my tent slowly, methodically, taking care to secure the stakes and lay the ground sheet perfectly. Part of me still felt that this was supposed to be a relaxing escape. I started a small fire, stacked wood neatly, and made myself some coffee in the fading light. As the sun sank lower, I could hear the distant sounds of the forest waking up in its own nocturnal rhythm. The faint rustling of small animals in the leaves, the creaking of branches swaying with the wind, a far-off bird calling one last time before night fully descended. Night hit hard and fast. Darkness enveloped everything, and the small circle of light from my fire felt fragile and insignificant. I could hear every small sound, the scuff of something moving in the underbrush, the crack of twigs under unseen feet, the whisper of wind through the branches. I convinced myself that nothing would happen, that this was all normal and safe. I had a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a fully charged phone, even if the signal was weak. Still, I could feel my senses sharpening without me meaning to. Every little sound was magnified, and I found myself pausing, holding my breath, straining to hear what I knew was probably nothing. I eventually crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent, the walls of nylon doing little to protect me from the sounds outside. That's when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, like wet earth, but there was something metallic underneath it, a sharpness that made my stomach turn. I unzipped the tent flap a little to peer outside. The fire was dying down, and the shadows were twisting unnaturally. For a moment, I thought I saw a movement in the trees on the edge of the clearing. It was subtle, just the corner of my eye catching something that shouldn't have been there. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. I tried to sleep, rolling over, closing my eyes, telling myself it was all in my head. Then, faintly at first, I heard it, the sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps moving through the leaves. Not like a small animal, but larger. Someone, or something, was walking just beyond the edge of my vision. I froze, straining to hear over my own heartbeat. The steps stopped for a second, then resumed, moving closer. I grabbed my flashlight, trying not to make noise, and unzipped the tent just enough to shine a narrow beam through the trees. The light caught movement, a figure, partially obscured by shadows, standing motionless and watching me. My heart slammed against my ribs, my body tensed, and for a few seconds I didn't breathe. I told myself it could be a hunter, someone else camping, but the way it stood, the stillness, didn't feel right. Hunters moved, they made noise. This was different. I backed away slowly, retreating into my tent, and shut the zipper as quietly as I could. I stayed still for what felt like an eternity, listening to the night. The footsteps resumed, moving around the perimeter of my clearing. Every now and then, the faintest rustle, the snap of a branch, made me flinch. I debated calling the police, but the lack of signal made it impossible. I was completely isolated. The rational part of me screamed that I had to get out, but I couldn't leave the tent without knowing where this person or animal, or whatever it was, might be. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. It was impossible to tell. The sound of breathing, of movement, stayed just outside. Sometimes I thought I could hear whispers carried by the wind, but every time I focused, there was nothing. I stayed in the tent, flashlight in hand, moving as little as possible. I tried to convince myself that it was an animal, a lost hiker, someone harmless, but the metallic smell returned, stronger now, and it made my stomach turn. It mixed with the cold night air in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. Eventually, I realized the fire had burned down completely. The only light was my dim flashlight, which I had to keep close. I considered climbing into my car, but it was parked a little away from the clearing, and moving toward it meant exposing myself. I stayed put, trying to keep my breathing quiet, hoping whoever or whatever was out there would leave. The footsteps grew slower, then stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. When the first hint of dawn began to break through the trees, I finally saw what had been circling my tent. The ground around me was churned up, flattened patches of grass, broken twigs, and footprints I didn't recognize. They were too large to be a normal hiker's shoes, but too human to be an animal. They moved in a wide circle around my tent, never coming close enough to touch it, but always present. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also a little relieved. At least whatever it was had left me untouched. I stayed in the tent, watching the light grow, until it was strong enough to see clearly. Then I packed up quickly, throwing everything into my backpack with shaking hands, trying to make as little noise as possible. I didn't stop to eat or make coffee. I left the clearing and moved toward the gravel road, sticking to the shadows and keeping my eyes on the trees. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, made me freeze. It took hours to make it back to the main road. Every car I saw, every sign of civilization, was a relief. When I finally reached a small town, I stopped at a diner, ordered coffee, and tried to calm myself. I could still feel the pressure in my chest, still hear the phantom steps in my mind. I told the waitress I needed a moment alone, and she nodded, probably thinking I was just tired from camping. I never went back to that forest, and I don't plan to, but I learned something important that weekend. Even in a controlled environment, even when you think you've prepared for everything, the natural world, and the unknown that exists within it, can overwhelm you in ways you never imagined. There's a line between adventure and danger, and sometimes you only realize you've crossed it when you feel the weight of eyes on you in the dark, when the forest becomes a maze of shadows and silence, when your heart races, and you understand just how alone you really are. Since then, I've been careful about where I go alone. I make sure someone knows my route, that my phone is fully charged, and I stick to areas that feel truly safe. I've learned to respect the forest and the unpredictability of life in remote areas. And most importantly, I've learned that sometimes the scariest moments are not about what happens, but about the knowledge that something, or someone was there just beyond the edge of light, watching and waiting while you had no power to stop it. Even now, months later, I still think about that night. The forest can feel peaceful from a distance, almost inviting. But I know better. I know that beneath that calm, there is the potential for danger, for fear, and for the kind of silence that presses in on you until it feels impossible to breathe. And I know that being truly alone in that environment is an experience that never really leaves you. The fear, the anticipation, the knowledge that someone or something could have been there and left without a trace stays with you. It becomes part of you, a quiet caution that shapes how you see the world. I've shared the story with friends and family, but no one really understands the weight of it. They nod, offer advice, or laugh it off. But when I close my eyes at night, when I picture the edge of that clearing and the shadows in the trees, I remember exactly how it felt. Powerless, watched, and completely alone, surrounded by a darkness that wasn't just the night, but a living, breathing uncertainty. And I carry that memory with me, a reminder of what can happen when preparation meets the unpredictable, when adventure meets the raw, indifferent reality of the world outside the safety of civilization. It taught me to never take safety for granted, to respect the quiet power of nature, and to understand that fear isn't always about what's in front of you. It's about what's lurking just beyond the edge of perception, waiting for the moment you think you're alone to remind you how fragile that sense of security really is. That night changed me. I returned to city life with a new perspective, a new wariness, and a sense of humility about how small and vulnerable we are when faced with the unknown. I will never forget it, and I know I never will. The forest is quiet, calm, and beautiful, but I carry with me the knowledge that it can also be terrifying, and that sometimes the scariest thing of all is knowing that someone, or something, was there watching, and that you were completely alone. I remember the day started like any other, with the sun hanging low over the horizon, spilling pale orange light across the uneven dirt road. I had decided to hike alone that morning, heading into a section of the forest I had never explored before. It was mid-September, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of decaying leaves. I had packed lightly, a small backpack with water, a granola bar, a map, and a flashlight that I barely expected to need. The plan was simple: walk for a few hours, enjoy the quiet, maybe take some pictures. I never imagined the quiet would turn into something oppressive, or that I would realize just how alone I really could be. The trail started easy, a worn path between tall pines with their needles forming a soft carpet underfoot. Birds called sporadically, and I could hear the faint rustle of squirrels chasing each other. As I walked deeper, the trees grew denser, and the sunlight faded to a dull glow, leaving long shadows that stretched across the ground. The forest had a strange way of compressing sound. Each step on the leaves felt loud, echoing in the silence. After about an hour, I reached a narrow ridge. From there, I could see the forest opening into a small valley below, covered in fog that had begun to roll in with the late morning chill. I paused for a moment, taking in the view, feeling a sense of isolation that was both thrilling and uncomfortable. I had been walking for another hour when I realized I had lost the trail. The path had disappeared, swallowed by undergrowth and fallen branches. I tried to backtrack, but everything looked the same. Trees of similar height and bark pattern repeated endlessly, and any landmark I thought I had seen was now obscured. My stomach tightened as I realized I had no clear sense of direction. I stopped to check the map, but it was far too general for this level of detail, just showing major trails and roads. I was somewhere in between, completely alone, with only the distant sound of a stream and the occasional creak of a tree limb swaying in the wind. I decided to keep moving uphill, reasoning that higher ground might give me a better view and possibly a way to reorient myself. Every step became slower and more deliberate as the terrain got rougher. Roots snaked across the ground like blackened veins, and fallen logs blocked my path, forcing me to climb over or around them. At one point, I slipped on a damp rock and barely caught myself on a thin tree branch, scraping my palms and twisting my ankles slightly. My heart rate shot up, partly from the exertion and partly from a creeping sense of fear. The forest had gone quiet. Even the birds had stopped calling. The air felt thicker, colder, and I could smell the dampness of the soil mingled with the sharp, metallic scent of something I couldn't identify. As I continued, the sky darkened unexpectedly, though it was still midday. A storm was approaching, I realized too late, the clouds rolling in fast and heavy. Rain began to fall in light drizzles, and soon it turned into a downpour. My clothes were soaked through in minutes, the cold seeping into my bones. The ground became slick with mud, and each step was a potential slip. I tried to stay calm, telling myself I could find shelter or at least descend to safer ground. But the forest was thick, and every direction seemed equally impenetrable. The sound of water rushing over rocks grew louder, and I eventually found the stream I had heard earlier. It was a small, fast-flowing trickle that cut through the valley, but even reaching it had been a struggle over tangled roots and slippery boulders. I followed the stream, hoping it might lead to a road or a campsite. The rain fell harder, and branches whipped across my face as I pushed through dense thickets. The water from the stream splashed over my boots, chilling my feet painfully. I lost track of time. Minutes felt like hours. Then I noticed something odd, a shape moving in the water, or maybe just a shadow. I stopped, squinting through the rain, heart hammering, convinced for a moment that it was someone else. The forest seemed too remote for anyone to be there, but the shape shifted, indistinct and unnerving. I turned quickly, but there was nothing, just the blur of trees and rain. I shook my head, trying to steady myself, telling myself it was just a trick of the light and my imagination running wild. Hours passed, or maybe just one long, excruciating stretch. I was cold, hungry, and soaked, my clothes clinging to my skin. The forest was darker now, the rain having intensified, hammering on the leaves with a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. Mud covered my legs, and my shoes were heavy with water. I realized I couldn't follow the stream any longer. It had split into a tangle of narrow, fast-flowing channels, impassable without risking a fall. I looked around, desperately searching for any kind of shelter. That's when I saw it, a small overhang of rock near a cluster of trees. It wasn't much, but it would keep the rain off my head. I dragged myself there, collapsing against the stone, my muscles trembling. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, and the rain drowned out everything else. For a while, I just sat there, shivering and trying to catch my breath, wondering how long I could survive out here if I couldn't find a way out. The storm lasted what felt like an eternity. Trees bent under the wind, and lightning split the sky in the distance, followed by the low, rolling growl of thunder. I felt utterly small, insignificant, and alone, but I also felt a strange clarity. Fear had honed every sense. I could hear branches snapping under the force of the wind, the water rushing over rocks, the tiny scuttling of something moving nearby, maybe an animal seeking shelter just like me. Hunger and exhaustion were secondary to the primal need to survive, to keep moving, to find a way back to safety. When the storm finally subsided, it left a damp, eerie calm. Mist hung low in the valleys, and the forest floor glistened. I started moving again, slower but deliberate, testing each step before committing my weight. I noticed footprints in the mud, small, human-like, but too faint and irregular to identify clearly. For a moment, panic surged again. Was someone else here? Should I hide? But as I followed the footprints, I realized they led in the direction I hoped, toward lower ground, toward a more open area where I might see the road or a campsite. After another hour of careful trekking, I saw it, a faint, straight line between the trees, a path I could recognize. My legs ached, but adrenaline surged. I ran, slipping several times, but each slip brought me closer to safety. Finally, the trees thinned, and I saw a clearing. Beyond it, I could make out a gravel road. Cars passed occasionally, their tires crunching on the gravel, and I waved my arms frantically when I saw one. A truck slowed and stopped. The driver leaned out, a look of concern on his face, as I explained, panting and shivering, that I had been lost in the woods for hours. He nodded, letting me climb into the cab, and I sank into the seat, drenched and exhausted, finally feeling warmth and safety. The ride back to town was quiet. I stayed wrapped in the warmth of the heater, my mind replaying every detail. The ridge, the lost path, the storm, the eerie shapes in the forest, and the silence that pressed in from all sides. I realized how fragile my sense of safety was, how quickly the familiar could vanish, and how small one person could feel against the vast, indifferent wilderness. I was safe now, but the experience stayed with me, a reminder of how easily the ordinary world could vanish, and how important it was to respect the wild spaces I had always taken for granted. I didn't speak much that day, just went home, stripped off the mud-soaked clothes, and showered, feeling the water wash away more than just dirt. The tension, the fear, the endless hours of uncertainty. The forest had shown me its power, its indifference, and in surviving it, I found a clarity and a deep respect for the quiet, dangerous beauty of the world outside civilization. By nightfall, I sat on my porch, still shivering slightly, but feeling a quiet satisfaction. I had navigated fear, exhaustion, and the elements. I had survived. And though I would remember every detail, the shadows, the cold, the storm, the disorientation, the ending was clear. I was alive, I had made it back, and I had learned to move carefully, observe deeply, and respect the world that can so easily overwhelm a person alone. The forest no longer felt like a playground. It was a living, breathing place, powerful and unforgiving, but I had faced it and emerged whole. And in that realization, I felt a sense of calm I would carry with me long after the mud and rain had been washed away. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, leaving the world around me shrouded in darkness that felt heavier than usual. I had been hiking all day through a stretch of wilderness I had never explored before, following a narrow trail that wound between dense groves of pine and oak. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and fallen leaves, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes and hair, making you feel as though you are a part of the forest itself. At first, the trail had been easy, almost inviting, with the sounds of birds fading into the quiet hum of insects as evening approached. But the deeper I went, the more oppressive the quiet became. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me flinch, my senses taut and jittery. I had set out with the intention of reaching a small clearing I had read about in an old hiking forum, a place supposedly untouched and beautiful, where a stream ran through a flat meadow surrounded by thick forest on all sides. It was supposed to be the perfect spot to camp, to spend the night under the stars, and to escape the constant noise and pressure of daily life. By the time I realized how long I had been walking, the trail had become almost indistinguishable, the markers I had been following hours ago completely gone. Shadows stretched and twisted between the trees, and every tree trunk seemed to stare back at me, their branches swaying as if moving of their own accord. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was just the darkness and my imagination running wild, but my stomach churned with unease. The last few hours of daylight had faded entirely, leaving only the cold, metallic glow of the moon, barely visible through a thick canopy. My flashlight cut through the blackness in a thin, trembling beam, illuminating roots and rocks that threatened to trip me at every step. I kept checking my phone for GPS signal, but there was nothing, not even a bar. The battery was dwindling, and the thought of being completely alone, lost in a place where no one could find me, began to weigh heavily on me. My legs ached from hours of hiking, my throat was dry, and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since early morning. The forest around me had gone from a place of peace to a cage, dark and unyielding. At one point, I stumbled over a fallen tree, my hands scraping against rough bark, and my knees caked with dirt. As I pushed myself upright, I thought I saw something move between the trees ahead. A figure? Or maybe a shadow? My heart pounded violently against my ribs. I froze, straining to hear any sound, and there it was, the soft crunch of leaves, deliberate, slow, approaching. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to obey at first. I told myself it could just be an animal, a deer maybe, but the sound had a weight to it, a purpose that no deer could make. I fumbled with my flashlight, trying to get a wider view, and that's when I noticed it. Eyes. Small, reflective dots catching the faint moonlight through the branches. They were low to the ground, maybe a few feet away, just barely visible. My first thought was a wolf, but the shape was wrong, too human, too deliberate in its movement. Panic surged through me like electricity. I turned, trying to retrace my steps to the last familiar marker, only to realize I had no idea which direction I had come from. Every tree looked the same, every shadow seemed to move. I started running, my legs carrying me blindly over rocks and roots, branches tearing at my arms and face. The sound followed me, soft at first, then growing louder, like something tracking me, matching my pace, adjusting to my speed. My breath came in ragged gasps, lungs burning, legs screaming, but I could not stop. Falling to my knees at one point, I clawed at the ground, trying to catch my footing, but the leaves were slick with dew, and I slid back several feet before scrambling up again. Hours, or maybe it was only minutes, passed in this disoriented flight. I had no idea how far I had gone, only that the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My mind kept running through possibilities, none of them comforting. I had left the main trail hours ago. There was no signal, no one around, and that presence behind me, or in my periphery, was relentless. Sometimes I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision, and every time I spun my head, nothing was there. But the rustle of leaves, the snap of twigs, never stopped. Eventually, I collapsed near a large boulder, gasping and trembling. My flashlight flickered, dimming as the batteries neared their end. I leaned against the stone, trying to calm my racing heart. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, impossibly close, almost under my skin. My stomach dropped, and I froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound was different from anything I had heard in the forest before. It was not a deer, not a coyote, not even a wolf. Whatever it was aware of me, and it was aware of my fear. I forced myself up, ignoring the searing pain in my legs, and started moving again, slower this time, trying to find some sign of the trail, some indication of human presence. My ears strained for anything, a distant hum of a road, the trickle of water. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard it. The faint sound of moving water, a gentle ripple against rocks. almost hidden by the forest's muffled acoustics. Relief and renewed fear collided inside me. Water meant I could find the stream, the clearing I had hoped to reach, but it also meant I had to leave the cover of trees, exposing myself if anything else was in the forest. Step by careful step, I moved toward the sound, crouching low, holding my flashlight close to the ground, scanning for movement. My body ached, my eyes burned from strain, but I forced myself onward. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the edge of the clearing I had been searching for. The moonlight spilled over the flat meadow, illuminating a small stream that gurgled peacefully, a stark contrast to the chaos of the forest. I dropped to my knees beside the water, splashing my face and drinking greedily. The cool water steadied me, bringing clarity and calm I hadn't felt in hours. I took stock of my surroundings, realizing for the first time how lucky I was to have found it. The clearing was surrounded by dense trees, giving me some sense of enclosure and safety, though I stayed alert, listening for any sound in the shadows. I noticed a large, fallen log near the edge of the stream and dragged myself over, using it as a makeshift seat. Exhausted, I leaned back, letting the stars above fill my vision, and tried to calm the trembling in my limbs. Time passed slowly as I rested, and eventually, I gathered enough strength to set up a small sleeping area. I found some dry leaves and smaller branches, arranging them as a cushion, and used my backpack as a pillow. The sound of the stream was comforting, masking the noises of the forest, giving me a rhythm to follow as I drifted into a restless sleep. I stayed alert, one eye open for movement, heart hammering with every small sound, but the immediate threat seemed to have passed. Morning came with pale light filtering through the trees, casting long, soft shadows across the meadow. I felt a sense of cautious relief as I packed my few belongings, knowing I had survived the night. The forest that had seemed so menacing in the darkness now appeared manageable, its beauty slowly revealing itself. I followed the stream downstream, hoping it would lead me to a more familiar trail. After some time, the sounds of civilization began to reach me. Distant cars, birdsong that seemed louder and friendlier, and eventually a faint dirt road visible through a break in the trees. I emerged onto the road, blinking in the daylight, the relief washing over me in an almost dizzying wave. I found a small parked car further down, a farmer heading to his field. I flagged him down, explaining my situation, and he offered me a ride back to town. The memory of the night's terror stayed with me, the feeling of being stalked, the relentless darkness, the crushing solitude, but I had made it through alive. By the time I reached my own car, parked on the edge of the forest where I had started, the sun was fully up. The forest loomed silently behind me, indifferent, holding its secrets and dangers still within. I sat for a long moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, breathing in the morning air, and realized that fear had sharpened every sense, forced me to survive, and had given me a new respect for the wilderness. The danger had passed, and I had learned that even in the darkest, most terrifying moments, perseverance and awareness could guide me through. I drove home slowly, still shaken, but with a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that the night had not broken me, and that I could navigate the world, even its darkest corners, without losing myself. I never returned to that part of the forest, but I carried the memory with me, a reminder of how fragile life can feel, how relentless fear can be, and how survival often depends on nothing more than calm thinking, steady movements, and refusing to give up when every instinct tells you to run. I was driving late one evening on a stretch of road that seemed to go on forever, lined with dense woods on either side. The sun had set hours ago, and the darkness pressed against the edges of my headlights. The road was narrow, winding, and uneven, with patches of gravel and potholes that jostled the car every few seconds. I had taken this route many times before, but tonight something felt off. The air was heavier, colder, and every rustle in the trees made me tense. My car's engine hummed steadily, but even that familiar sound felt different, as if it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. About an hour into the drive, I noticed the fog rolling in, thick and low, hugging the ground like a blanket. It was strange for this time of year, but it didn't make sense to turn back. The further I drove, the denser it became. My headlights barely penetrated more than a few feet in front of me. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. Every now and then, the fog seemed to shift in odd ways, creating shapes that made me flinch, like shadows of people standing on the roadside. but whenever I blinked or looked again, there was nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the unease settled in deep, crawling into my chest with a slow, suffocating pressure. After another 20 minutes of cautious driving, I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I got closer, I realized it was a car stopped on the side of the road. Its hazard lights blinked intermittently, painting the fog in red bursts. I slowed down and pulled over cautiously. The car looked old, worn out, the paint faded and chipped. I peered inside and saw that it was empty. Strange. No driver, no passengers, nothing. The door was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the light breeze. I got out of my car, my boots crunching against the gravel, and approached it slowly. There was no sign of struggle, no tire tracks indicating it had skidded off the road. Just a car abandoned. My stomach churned, a dull ache spreading through my gut. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, the hair standing up. Something about this felt wrong. I circled the car, looking for any signs of what might have happened. There was a faint smell of gasoline, sharp and acrid, and the engine was cold. I even tapped on the windows, hoping to see if anyone might be trapped inside, but there was nothing. The fog seemed to thicken around me, and every sound was amplified. The distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of branches, the faint hum of my own heartbeat. I tried to convince myself to leave, to get back in my car and drive away, but then I noticed it, tire tracks leading off the road into the trees. They were fresh, the mud still moist, and they disappeared quickly into the darkness. Curiosity mixed with fear, a terrible combination. I knew following them was dangerous, but I couldn't resist. Something inside me needed to know what had happened. I pulled my flashlight from the glove compartment and started into the woods, following the tracks. The forest was dense, the trees towering above me, their branches tangled like skeletal arms. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been, cracking twigs underfoot, the beam of my flashlight bouncing across tree trunks and leaves. The tracks led me down a slight incline, deeper into a part of the woods I didn't recognize. The fog clung to everything, muffling sounds but also making the forest feel closer, more suffocating. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and I had to shake my head to keep from imagining figures moving just beyond the light. After walking for what felt like an eternity, I came across a clearing. In the middle stood the abandoned car from the road, but now it was covered in scratches, the windows shattered, the tires flat. It was as if something had been there, clawing at it. The mud around it was churned up, like a struggle had taken place. And then I noticed the footprints. Not the cars, but others, bare footprints, deep and irregular, leading from the woods to the car, and then disappearing back into the forest. The more I stared at them, the more I realized they weren't human. Too large, too long, the toes spaced in ways that made no sense. My heart raced, panic clawing at my chest. I wanted to turn back, but I also knew if I ran, I might trip or lose my footing. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but some perverse part of me wanted to see what was there. I turned slowly, shining the flashlight in the direction the footprints had come from. That's when I heard it, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy moving through underbrush. I froze. The sound was slow, deliberate, getting closer. My stomach turned. I backed up toward the car, trying to keep the beam of light steady, but it bounced across trees and undergrowth. The sound stopped. Absolute silence. I thought maybe I had imagined it. But then, from behind, a branch snapped sharply. My head whipped around, flashlight shaking. There was nothing visible, but the sense of being watched pressed down on me. My chest heaved. The logical part of me screamed to leave, but I was frozen, rooted by a combination of fear and disbelief. I realized then that my phone was still in my pocket. I fumbled for it, hands trembling, and tried to turn on the flashlight. Nothing. Dead. The battery had died in the cold. A wave of dread washed over me. No car lights, no street lights, no way to call for help. Just the forest, the fog, and whatever was out there. I considered running, but every direction looked the same, endless trees and thick undergrowth. I had no landmarks. My only choice was to move cautiously, keep the flashlight in my hand, and follow the tracks back the way I came. I started walking, slow, deliberate steps, trying to avoid making noise. Every snapped twig made me flinch. I could hear the forest settling around me, the wind moving leaves, distant animal calls, but nothing that could explain the feeling of being followed. Minutes passed, maybe half an hour. Time was hard to measure in the oppressive darkness. Then I heard it again, faint at first, then closer. The sound of something dragging behind me. It didn't stop. I forced myself to keep moving, forcing one foot in front of the other, my body tight with tension. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet. Every rustle felt like a step behind me. Every shadow felt like a figure. I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind unraveling in the darkness. Finally, I stumbled upon a slight rise in the terrain, and through the fog, I caught a glimpse of my car. Relief flooded through me, sharp and sudden, but it was tempered by fear. The car looked farther than I remembered, and the forest between felt endless. I pushed myself, running now, boots slapping against mud, branches tearing at my jacket. The sound behind me grew louder, faster, erratic. I dared not look back. My legs burned, lungs screaming for air. I reached the edge of the road, collapsed into the gravel, gasping, my car only feet away. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine, my hands shaking violently. As I drove away, the fog began to thin, the darkness retreating slightly under the weak glow of streetlights up ahead. My heart still pounded, and my breath came in harsh gasps, but I forced myself to focus on the road. When I finally reached a well-lit area, I pulled over again, trying to calm down, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. The images of the footprints, the abandoned car, and the dragging sound were burned into my mind. I called the police, reported the car, and described the tracks, though I doubted they could make sense of it. Weeks later, I heard that the car had belonged to someone who had disappeared in those woods months before, never found. The area was notorious for dense forests and uneven terrain, people sometimes going missing without a trace. It hit me then that I had been lucky to get out. Every time I drive past that stretch of road now, I slow down, my eyes scanning the woods, but I never stop again. I've learned that curiosity in the dark can be dangerous. That night, I realized just how thin the line is between normal and terrifying, and how quickly it can be crossed without warning. I survived, yes, but the memory of that dragging sound, the strange footprints, and the abandoned car follow me even now, a constant reminder that some parts of the world are better left unexplored. The experience changed me. I stopped taking isolated roads at night. I started carrying extra batteries and a charged phone. I learned to trust instinct over curiosity, to leave when something feels wrong. Most importantly, I realized that fear can be a survival tool, a signal that something is very, very wrong, and ignoring it can have consequences you may never live down. Even now, I wake up sometimes, heart pounding, thinking I hear the faint scrape of something behind me. But I know I made it out, and that knowledge, hard-won and unforgettable, is what keeps me going. I woke up that morning to the kind of sky that made the whole forest look colder than it actually was. A thin layer of fog had settled between the trees, curling around the trunks and clinging to the underbrush. The air had that damp, earthy smell, the one that makes your clothes feel slightly wet even when it hasn't rained. I had arrived late the night before, hiking in alone with nothing but a small pack, a tent, and the basic supplies. The place was remote, more remote than I had realized from the map. The parking area where I left my car was a good mile away, past a narrow dirt track that wound through thick woods. By the time I set up my tent, the sun was already dipping behind the ridges, and the temperature had dropped fast. I didn't mind the cold, not yet, not when the quiet was so complete. The kind of quiet that fills your ears so much that you notice even the tiniest sound. The snap of a twig, the skitter of a small animal across leaves, the wind brushing against the trees. That silence was heavy, almost tangible. I spent the first few hours unpacking and arranging my gear, making sure everything was in order. The area around my tent was mostly flat, with patches of pine needles covering the dirt. Small rocks jutted out in places, and fallen branches were scattered everywhere. I built a small fire, careful to contain it with stones, and cooked a quick meal. The flames flickered and cast long shadows, turning the surrounding trees into dark, looming shapes. I watched them for a while, listening to the occasional rustle of animals in the undergrowth, feeling the normal mix of nervousness and excitement that comes with being completely alone in the woods. By late afternoon, I decided to explore a little. I didn't go far, just a short walk along a narrow trail that led up a ridge. The fog made everything look softer, but it also made it easy to lose a sense of direction. The trees were tall and dense, with branches that intertwined overhead, making the light even dimmer. I noticed tracks in the mud, deer mostly, but there were other, less familiar prints too. They were larger than a human foot, and the spacing was irregular, like whoever or whatever had made them was moving with a strange, awkward gait. I tried not to let my imagination run wild, chalking it up to some weird pattern of fallen leaves and mud shapes. I spent the next hour walking along the ridge, taking in the sights. The fog shifted with the wind, revealing glimpses of distant hills and patches of bare rock. I stopped to look down a steep incline where a small creek wound its way through the valley. The water was dark and fast-moving, the sound barely audible through the thick fog and trees. I turned back toward my campsite and started the descent. That's when I noticed it, the smell. It was faint at first, like damp earth mixed with something metallic, like blood. I froze, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It wasn't constant, and the wind shifted, carrying it away and bringing it back intermittently. My stomach tightened, a deep, instinctive unease settling over me. I didn't want to acknowledge it, but I knew something wasn't right. I moved faster, careful to stay on the trail, but as I descended, I began to notice more signs. Broken branches at unusual angles, deep scratches on tree trunks. The underbrush flattened in places as if something heavy had pushed through. My pace quickened, and then I saw the first real evidence. A pile of dirt and leaves moved slightly, as if something had just shifted beneath it. My heart was pounding, my breath shallow. I stopped, listening. Nothing. Then I heard it, a low, dragging sound, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere down the slope. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it, a presence moving through the woods with a weight that made the ground feel alive under its steps. I didn't know what it was, but I knew instinctively that it was dangerous. I broke into a run, slipping on the loose soil and wet leaves, trying to get back to my tent. My pack was bouncing against my back, pulling me backward with every step, but I ignored it. I focused on the sound. Whatever it was moving too, keeping pace in a way that no animal should have been able to. The dragging noise became more distinct, mixed with heavy breathing, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't just following me, it was closing in. I stumbled over a root, falling hard on my hands and knees, scraping my palms. The sound stopped for a moment, then started again, closer. I scrambled to my feet and ran, the fog disorienting me, turning familiar shapes into threats. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to get to safety. Finally, I saw the edge of my clearing. My tent was there, small and fragile looking in the fading light. I didn't care about the fire, about my gear, about anything. I ran straight to it and shoved the door open, throwing myself inside. I zipped it up as fast as I could, fumbling with trembling hands. My heart was racing, every beat loud in my ears. I pressed myself against the back wall, listening. Outside, I could hear the dragging again, circling, stopping, moving. Whatever it was, it knew where I was. The noises shifted, scratching against the tent's thin fabric, heavy enough to make it shiver. I stayed still, hardly breathing, eyes wide in the dim light, every nerve taut. Time passed, or maybe it didn't. Minutes stretched into hours. The sound outside remained, sometimes pausing, sometimes dragging, sometimes low, guttural breaths, almost human in their rhythm, but wrong in every other way. I didn't move. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. I could feel my muscles cramping, my body trembling from fear and cold, but I stayed pressed to the back of the tent, watching the shadows dance through the fabric. Every noise outside made my stomach drop. Every sudden rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig under invisible weight, made me flinch. At some point, it moved on, or maybe it just circled far enough away that I could no longer hear it clearly. The fog began to thin as night deepened, and the sounds faded into the distance. I stayed in the tent, shaking, until the first weak light of dawn began to seep through the fabric. I unzipped the door slowly, peering out. The forest looked normal again, deceptively calm. Broken branches were scattered, and the ground was churned up in places where the creature, or whatever it was, had passed. My fire pit was overturned, stones scattered, a faint smell of something metallic still lingering in the air. I realized I had barely eaten, barely slept, barely breathed. My entire body ached, and the thought of leaving the tent made my legs feel like lead. But I knew I had to move, had to get out of there before whatever had been circling returned. I packed quickly, gathering what I could, leaving anything I didn't need. Every sound made me jump. The forest seemed alive again, but now I moved with purpose, scanning constantly. I took a different route down the ridge, keeping higher ground when possible, moving fast and quietly. My eyes stayed on the tree line, my ears alert for the slightest hint of movement. I followed a faint deer trail, hoping it would lead me back to the dirt track and my car. It was slow going, and my legs screamed with the effort, but I kept going. Eventually, I emerged from the thickest part of the forest onto the narrow road. Relief washed over me in waves. I didn't slow down. I ran all the way to my car, slipping and stumbling on the mud and rocks, ignoring the pain in my hands and knees. When I finally reached the car, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I unlocked it, threw my pack inside, and climbed in. My hands were shaking too badly to start the engine at first. I could see the forest behind me, quiet now, deceptively peaceful, as if nothing had happened at all. I started the car and drove without looking back, down the narrow dirt track, out onto the main road. I didn't stop until I reached a small gas station in the next town. Only then did I breathe properly. Only then did my legs stop trembling. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the forest in the distance, still thick with morning fog. I knew I had been lucky. Whatever it was that had followed me, it hadn't attacked directly. It had let me live. But the marks on the ground, the smell, the sounds, they were proof that it had been real, proof that I had been incredibly close to something dangerous and unseen. I spent the rest of the day driving home, keeping the forest behind me, the memory of every sound, every shadow, every step burned into my mind. I didn't return to that trail. I didn't even try to hike in that area again. I realized that some parts of the woods are better left alone, especially when you can't see what's out there, waiting, moving silently through the trees. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder that the forest is alive in ways you can't control, and that sometimes survival is about nothing more than running, staying silent, and trusting your instincts. I was lucky that day. I survived, and I never doubted for a moment that if I had hesitated even slightly, I might not have made it out at all. The first time I went hiking alone in the backcountry, I thought I knew what I was getting into. I had done shorter trails with friends, but this one was different, a remote section of forest that snaked along a ridge far from any road, a place where maps were vague and cell service almost non-existent. I packed lightly, bringing only water, some granola bars, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and my old reliable compass. I left my phone in the car, mostly out of habit. I wanted the silence of the forest, the isolation, to feel truly alone. I started in the late morning, the sun already bright and high, cutting sharp lines through the tall pines. The air smelled like wet earth and pine sap, and a light breeze rustled the needles above me. At first, it was peaceful. The trail was uneven, covered in roots and loose rocks, but not overly difficult. Birds chirped intermittently, and a few squirrels darted across my path. I kept a steady pace, knowing that once the sun dipped behind the ridges, shadows would fall fast, and it would become nearly impossible to navigate. By mid-afternoon, the forest had started to thicken. The trail narrowed, and in places, it was barely visible through the undergrowth. I noticed the temperature dropping as the sun's angle changed, a chill that went through my jacket and made me pull the collar up around my neck. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a stream gurgled quietly, and I could hear the faint scratching of branches against the ground. At first, it was subtle, easy to ignore, but over time, the sound seemed to get closer, like someone or something was moving around me. I kept telling myself it was just animals, deer or maybe raccoons, but the sound had a rhythm, like deliberate steps, light but consistent. I stopped and stood perfectly still, straining my ears. The wind shifted, carrying a subtle but distinct heavy breathing. My heart began to pound. I reminded myself to stay calm. Panic never helps in situations like this. I checked my compass and tried to pick out landmarks, but the trees all looked alike. I had gone further than I thought, and the trail had split somewhere back there. Now, I was unsure of which way I had come. I decided to move forward slowly, keeping my senses alert. Each step was careful, deliberate, placing my boots firmly on the damp ground. Shadows stretched long and dark, twisting the shapes of the trees into jagged, unnatural forms. The breathing sound followed me. Every time I paused, it seemed to pause too, only to resume once I started moving again. It wasn't like any animal I had heard. There was no scratching or growling, only that slow, heavy exhalation, close enough now that I could feel the vibrations in the air. As the hours passed, I started to feel the first real pangs of fear. I had underestimated how quickly isolation can turn into terror when you know there is no one around for miles. I tried to calm myself by scanning for signs of wildlife. Tracks, broken branches, claw marks. Everything looked normal at first glance, but there was an unsettling symmetry to the disturbance of leaves and twigs, like someone, or something, had moved in a measured way, careful not to make too much noise, always keeping just out of view. Sunlight dwindled. The forest became a tangle of darkness and movement, the shadows so deep that my flashlight seemed weak. I flicked it on, the beam cutting a narrow path through the trees, but even with it, shapes loomed in the corners of my vision. I could feel my pulse in my ears. I tried to focus on practical things, footing, navigation, staying on course, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the sound of breathing. I had no choice but to keep moving, always forward, hoping to find the trailhead, or at least a recognizable landmark. I stumbled upon a small clearing. The ground was soft and mossy, and a fallen tree lay across one edge. I paused, crouching behind it, trying to catch my breath and make sense of the situation. That's when I noticed the tracks. Deep, wide, irregular, definitely not human. My stomach sank. I scanned the surrounding forest, feeling the oppressive weight of being completely exposed. The tracks led deeper into the woods, following a vague path that I had been unknowingly circling. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I had no idea which way was back. The sun finally dipped below the ridge, leaving only faint twilight to guide me. The forest seemed to close in around me. I could hear the breathing again, closer now, and a new sound, soft, almost like something brushing through the underbrush, deliberate and careful, circling me. My flashlight flickered in my hand as I moved cautiously toward what I hoped was a slope that would lead back to the trailhead. My legs were stiff and sore, my mind on high alert. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made me flinch. I knew I had to stay calm, but the fear was relentless, gnawing at my thoughts. I found a slight rise and scrambled up, the earth slick beneath my boots. From there, I could see faint glimmers of light reflecting off something farther down, a small stream, maybe, or an old trail marker. Relief surged briefly, but the breathing was right behind me. I froze, listening, feeling the cold sweat bead on my forehead. Then the sound stopped. Absolute silence, except for my own ragged breathing. I crouched low, waiting. Minutes passed like hours. When nothing happened, I moved slowly, inching toward the faint light. The stream came into view first, glinting faintly in the last remnants of daylight. I traced its edge until I spotted a narrow footbridge leading to a well-trodden trail. My heart lifted. Safety. A way out. But I kept glancing back, knowing that even though the light was ahead, something could still be behind me. Finally, I stepped onto the main trail. The undergrowth gave way to familiar dirt paths, and I recognized landmarks. The twisted pine I had passed earlier, a large boulder shaped like a crouching animal. I knew the parking lot couldn't be far. My legs shook as I walked, flashlight sweeping left and right, still expecting movement. I didn't hear anything more. Only the wind in the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. When I emerged from the forest, the parking lot was empty and quiet under the moonlight. I collapsed against my car, hands trembling. I checked the time. Hours had passed since I'd started, longer than I thought possible. I realized how close I had been to losing track of direction entirely. My supplies were low, and I was exhausted, but I felt an overwhelming relief. The forest was behind me now, dark and secretive, holding whatever had followed me in its depths. As I drove home slowly, headlights cutting across the road, I kept replaying every detail. The tracks, the breathing, the way the shadows moved. I didn't see what had been behind me, but I knew I had been followed. Maybe it was a wild animal, maybe something else. Whatever it was, it had stayed just far enough to remain hidden, patient, silent. By the time I reached home, the sun was fully down. I locked the doors, sat in the quiet of my apartment, and slowly let myself relax. I knew I had been lucky. Lucky to escape without injury. Lucky to find the trail. Lucky to have trusted my instincts. I never went back to that forest alone. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder of how fragile safety can feel when you're completely alone, and how quickly the familiar can turn terrifying when nature and isolation take over. Even weeks later, when I thought about that night, my chest would tighten. The memory of the breathing, close but unseen, kept me awake for nights. But at the same time, there was a strange sense of clarity. I had survived by staying calm, paying attention, and moving carefully. It was a lesson in patience, awareness, and respect for the unknown. And as scary as it had been, that night gave me a sense of accomplishment, knowing I could handle a real threat without losing my mind. From that day on, I never underestimated the forest or the quiet things that move unseen. I prepared more thoroughly, traveled in pairs when I could, and always kept a mental map of my surroundings. But I never forgot the sound of that breathing, close enough to feel, yet distant enough to remain invisible. And even years later, whenever I walk along a remote trail, my senses sharpen, my heart beats a little faster, and I remember that night when I learned how quickly peace can turn into fear, and how long it takes to reclaim calm once it's lost. The night air was heavy and damp as I trudged through the narrow dirt path, winding between the thick trees. The forest around me was dense, the kind where sunlight barely reaches the ground even at noon, and tonight, with the moon shrouded behind thick clouds, everything was drowned in darkness. The faint rustling of leaves in the cold breeze and the occasional crack of a twig beneath my boots were the only sounds accompanying me, and each one seemed far too loud in the quiet, amplifying the sense of isolation. I had been hiking all day, following a map I barely trusted, searching for a small clearing that was supposed to be ideal for camping. But as the night stretched on, I realized I was far off any path anyone would usually take. Every landmark I had counted on seemed to disappear in the shadows, and the forest felt like it was closing in, each tree a silent observer leaning over me. I finally reached what appeared to be a small opening, and decided it would have to do. The ground was uneven, covered with fallen branches and moss that had been soaking in the rain from earlier in the day. I set down my backpack and started gathering firewood, choosing pieces that were dry enough to catch fire quickly. As I worked, I noticed that the deeper parts of the forest around me were impossibly quiet, almost as if the normal nocturnal creatures had vanished. No owls, no rustling of small mammals, just an empty, suffocating stillness. I shook off the feeling of unease, telling myself that the forest was always this quiet in some areas at night. But the moment I struck a match and saw the small flame flicker to life, the shadows around me seemed to shift, becoming heavier, almost pressing against the light. The fire finally took hold, small flames licking the damp logs, casting flickering shadows on the nearby trees. I sat down close to it, warming my hands and letting the nervous energy drain from my body. The smell of wet earth and burning wood mingled in the air, grounding me for a moment, but the unease returned as soon as I started to hear faint noises again. It was subtle at first, a snapping of a branch here, a rustle of leaves there, always from the direction opposite of the clearing I had chosen. I froze, staring into the darkness, trying to tell my brain that it was just small animals, maybe a deer or a fox moving through the underbrush. But instinct told me otherwise. The sounds had a deliberate rhythm, a pattern that didn't belong to random forest life. It was soft at first, then gradually louder, closer, and my heart started pounding in my chest as I realized I might not be alone. I quickly scanned the clearing for anything that could offer cover, thinking of ways to protect myself if necessary. The firelight offered some visibility, but it barely reached the edges of the clearing. Shadows lurked just beyond the ring of light, and every movement made me flinch. I gathered a large branch, more of a makeshift weapon than anything else, and kept it close, my knuckles white from gripping it. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I couldn't just run blindly into the forest in the dark. I had no idea where I was. I had to be careful, had to make sure I knew the terrain first. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Every crack, every rustle sent me into a panic, but there was no clear sign of what or who was moving out there. Then I heard it, unmistakable, a low, deliberate footstep, heavy, pressing down on the soft forest floor just beyond the trees. It wasn't a person walking casually. It was deliberate, careful, calculating. My stomach dropped, and I realized that whoever it was had been watching me for some time. The hair on my arms stood on end. I debated leaving the fire, thinking I could sneak away, but the thought of stumbling through the dark, potentially into the hands of whoever was out there, terrified me more. I had to hold my ground. I decided to make the area around the fire seem more occupied, throwing a few branches into the flames, making them flare. The crackling fire lit up more of the clearing, and I caught the faintest glimpse of movement just at the edge of the light. A shadow taller than a man, shifting from tree to tree, pausing, watching. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to think rationally. Whoever, or whatever, was out there, they hadn't made any sound beyond the footsteps. No voice, no calls. Just presence. It was unnatural in its silence. Then, without warning, the wind shifted and a scent hit me. Not earthy or animal-like, but metallic, sharp. Blood. My stomach lurched. I scanned the darkness, every nerve on edge. I considered packing up and running, but I knew that once I stepped into the shadows, I'd be invisible to anyone else and completely at their mercy. I had to outthink them, not outpace them. Hours passed with this tense standoff. I barely dared move, feeding the fire only enough to keep the light alive, keeping my eyes constantly scanning the edges of the clearing. At some point, the rustling stopped, and the forest returned to its eerie quiet. I allowed myself a brief moment of relief, though my muscles stayed tight, ready to react. It was dawn, or close to it, when I finally noticed faint light breaking through the treetops. The fire had dwindled, and I knew I couldn't afford to stay any longer. I packed up slowly, deliberately, making sure not to snap any twigs or make noise that could reveal my presence. Every step felt like it echoed across the forest. I found a narrow trail leading away from the clearing, barely visible in the dim morning light. Following it, I kept my eyes peeled, but there was no one in sight. The trail led me to a small stream, the sound of running water filling my ears and masking any other sounds. I crouched by the water, drinking and splashing some on my face, the cold shock helping me focus. After a long time, I realized I could see a faint road in the distance, sun glinting off the asphalt. I picked up the pace, adrenaline carrying me over roots and rocks that would have tripped me up in daylight. By the time I reached the road, my body was exhausted, trembling from adrenaline and lack of sleep. I collapsed at the edge, taking deep breaths, trying to calm myself. The forest loomed behind me, silent and unreadable, hiding whatever had been stalking me. I didn't dare look back. I flagged down the first car I saw. A truck headed my way, and the driver gave me a startled look as I climbed in, covered in dirt and mud, trembling. I didn't explain much, just asked to be taken to the nearest town. The warmth of the truck and the hum of the engine felt like a lifeline. I kept my eyes on the road, never once glancing back at the forest. Once in town, I found a place to rest, a small motel that smelled faintly of mildew and old carpet. I locked the door, drew every curtain, and tried to settle down. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the images of the dark figure in the trees, the sound of footsteps that weren't mine, the metallic scent that still lingered in my mind. Days later, when I recounted the experience to authorities who advised caution for hikers, the reality of it started to sink in. What I had encountered out there wasn't just an animal, and it certainly wasn't friendly. The forest had held a predator patient and silent, and my survival had depended entirely on staying still, staying quiet, and thinking ahead. I never went back to that trail. I mapped out safer routes, joined group hikes, and carried extra safety equipment. But the memory of the heavy steps, the unseen watcher, and the suffocating silence of the forest stayed with me. It changed the way I approached nature, respect turning into wariness, and thrill into careful calculation. The experience left a scar that wasn't visible on my skin, but etched into the way I perceived the wilderness. I learned that the forest isn't forgiving, and danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently, unseen, until the perfect moment to strike, or to let you walk away, trembling but alive. I survived that night because of caution, observation, and a relentless focus on small details that might seem insignificant at first, but can mean the difference between life and death. The forest had tested me, and I had emerged from it, shaken but unbroken, carrying a lesson I would never forget. The first night settled over the forest quietly, but it felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was waiting. I had driven for hours along narrow, winding roads until the dense tree line swallowed the last glimmer of sunlight. The cabin stood in a small clearing, isolated, with an uneven dirt path leading to it that seemed to disappear into the shadows of the forest. I could feel the chill in the air immediately, the kind that gets under your skin and makes your limbs stiff. I parked the car, listening to the tires crunch against the gravel, and for a long moment I didn't move. Everything around me was still, except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional snap of a twig somewhere deeper in the woods. I had chosen this place for solitude, a break from the endless noise of the city, but the moment I stepped out of the car, I realized solitude in the middle of nowhere had a weight I hadn't anticipated. The cabin was small, made of old, weathered wood that creaked under the slightest pressure. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and the windows were grimy, reflecting the darkening sky like black mirrors. I could smell the faint scent of damp earth mixed with pine and something older, something almost like decay, but not fully. It was subtle, but it lingered. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and wood smoke, like it had been abandoned for months before anyone cared to check on it. I dropped my bag by the door and ran my hand over the rough surface of the walls, noticing small gaps where the cold air slipped in. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and every step echoed strangely in the confined space. I found the fireplace and tried the wood stacked neatly beside it. It was dry, though aged, and caught quickly when I struck a match. The warmth was immediate, but it didn't fully chase away the cold that seemed to settle deep into my bones. I started organizing the small kitchen area, setting out a pot and the few supplies I had brought. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying the sound of distant branches snapping under its force. I felt a twinge of unease, like being watched, but I shook it off, telling myself it was just the forest, nothing more. As darkness fully claimed the sky, I explored the small cabin more thoroughly. There were 2 bedrooms, one larger with a double bed and one smaller with a single. I ran my hand over the sheets, stale but clean enough, and made up the larger bed for the night. The bathroom was functional, though the water smelled faintly metallic when I turned the tap. Everything was intact, nothing was broken, but the cabin had this heavy stillness that made each creak of the floorboards louder than it should have been. I spent the first few hours sitting near the fire, watching the shadows dance along the walls. My mind kept flicking to noises outside, the distant snap of a branch, the faint rustle of movement I couldn't place. I reminded myself that it was just animals, deer or perhaps foxes moving through the trees. But when I looked out the window, all I saw were the deep shadows of the forest, black and endless. The clearing around the cabin felt smaller under the night sky, the shadows of the trees stretching toward it like fingers. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, the wind seemed to shift, carrying with it a new sound. A soft scrape across the outer wall, the faint crunch of leaves underfoot, so slight it could have been imagined. But each time I sat up and peered into the darkness, nothing moved. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, but the tension in my chest only grew. Around midnight, the sound became clearer. A deliberate step on the forest floor, not far from the cabin, though not close enough to identify. I held my breath, heart hammering, listening. Another step, and another, slow and measured. I couldn't tell what it was, human or animal. The sound circled the cabin slowly, making my stomach knot. I wanted to grab something for protection, anything, but my hands trembled too much to move. The fire crackled loudly, the only light and warmth I had, and I stared into it, trying to focus, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Minutes stretched. Each step outside seemed heavier, deliberate, almost taunting in its timing. I could hear the faint scrape of a boot, or claws, against the dirt path. My chest ached with adrenaline. I wanted to call out, to demand that whoever, or whatever, was there leave, but the thought of opening the door made my stomach twist. I realized how truly alone I was, surrounded by darkness and the sound of someone, or something, moving outside my fragile walls. I stayed awake for hours, eyes fixed on the window, fire dying slowly in the hearth. The steps continued, pacing, circling the cabin, stopping, starting again. At some point, I began to notice something else. Small, faint marks in the dirt outside, pressed into the soft earth of the clearing. They weren't large, maybe the size of a man's boot, but the spacing was uneven, like whoever left them was staggering or trying to move quietly while observing. I crouched low to the floor, tracing their path with my eyes. They stopped at the corner of the cabin, paused, and then seemed to disappear into the trees. Morning didn't come soon enough. I stayed vigilant, listening for any movement outside. The first gray light revealed more details. The ground was marked with scattered footprints and shallow impressions, the broken twigs and trampled underbrush forming a clear path that ended abruptly at the edge of the forest. Nothing had touched the cabin itself, nothing broken or moved inside. I felt an odd relief mixed with lingering fear. It was over, at least for now. I spent the next few hours preparing to leave. I gathered my supplies, checked the doors and windows, and packed the car carefully. The forest seemed calm, almost inviting under the morning sun, but the memory of the previous night's sounds clung to me. I looked back at the cabin one last time, the shadows of the trees now soft and pale. Everything was still. Driving away, the the feeling of isolation slowly ebbed, replaced by a tense awareness that the forest held secrets and movements I couldn't see. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white, as I retraced the narrow, winding road back to civilization. The experience stayed with me long after I left. The weight of being watched, the endless dark, the sound of deliberate steps outside a fragile shelter. Back in town, I went through my routine, but my mind remained tethered to that clearing and the cabin. I told myself it was likely a hunter or a wanderer, someone passing through, but part of me knew it didn't feel random. There was purpose in the movement, a presence that measured and watched. I began checking maps and news reports, curious if anyone had experienced something similar in that area. Occasionally, I found missing hiker reports or sightings of people traveling alone in the woods, but nothing concrete. Weeks later, I drove by the forest again, trying to see the clearing from the road. The cabin was no longer visible, hidden by overgrown underbrush and shadows from the tall trees. I realized then that part of the fear I felt was not just the immediate threat, but the awareness of how unprepared I had been, how small and vulnerable a person was alone in the vastness of nature. I felt both relief and a strange longing, a need to confront the fear again, but more prepared, more aware of the thin line between solitude and danger. The memory remained vivid in every forest I visited afterward. The sound of a twig snapping, the rustle of leaves in a sudden wind, the shape of shadows moving just out of sight, all reminded me of that night. But I learned from it too. I carried a flashlight, extra supplies, and a heightened sense of observation wherever I went. The fear never fully left, but it became manageable, a lesson in respecting the wilderness and the unknown that moves within it. In the end, the cabin was still standing when I last checked on satellite images, isolated and quiet, a small box in a sea of trees. Nothing supernatural had occurred, no mysterious force, no fantasy. Just the forest, its inhabitants, and a reminder of how quickly isolation can magnify fear, how the human mind reacts when faced with the unknown. I survived because I stayed alert, cautious, and patient. And for the first time, I understood that fear itself is often the most realistic threat, shaped by what you can't see and what might be out there, moving just beyond the light. The lesson stayed with me long after the forest faded behind me. Always respect isolation, always prepare, and never underestimate how quickly a quiet, empty place can become a place where every sound carries meaning, where every shadow might be someone, or something, watching. It was a terrifying night, but it ended clearly, without fantasy, without ghosts. It ended because I survived, observed carefully, and acted when it was necessary. And that clarity, that control, was something I carried with me from that night forward. A reminder that reality can be just as frightening as imagination if you aren't careful. The sun had already dipped low behind the hills when I drove down the narrow, twisting road toward the small cabin I had rented for the weekend. It was a remote place, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick forest on all sides, with only a small stream running somewhere close that I had spotted on the map. The GPS signal faded halfway through the drive, leaving me navigating by memory and the faint outlines of the dirt road. I had wanted isolation, a chance to escape the constant noise of the city, but as the trees grew denser and the shadows stretched longer, I felt a creeping unease that I couldn't quite shake. When I finally reached the cabin, the headlights illuminated the weathered structure, showing its peeling paint and the small, rickety porch that sagged slightly in the middle. I parked and stepped out, the cool air smelling of damp earth and pine. The silence was almost physical, pressing in from all sides. Even the sound of the wind felt distant, muffled by the dense forest. I carried my bag inside, fumbling with the keys that had been left in a lockbox as instructed. The door creaked loudly when I pushed it open, echoing in the empty interior. The cabin was small, just a single room with a tiny kitchen in one corner and a loft above where the bed was. It smelled faintly of mold and wood smoke, but otherwise it was functional enough. I set my bag down and tried to settle in, telling myself that the isolation was exactly why I had come. Night fell quickly. Without the lights of the city, the darkness outside the windows seemed almost solid, pressing against the glass like it wanted in. I lit the old lantern I had brought and sat at the small wooden table, eating a cold sandwich I had packed. The forest around me was alive with the sounds of night, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the occasional crack of a branch under the weight of some unseen animal. I tried to focus on reading, but my eyes kept darting to the windows, to the shadows that seemed to move just slightly differently than they should. I told myself it was just my imagination. Around midnight, I decided to go outside for a walk, thinking the fresh air would calm my nerves. The moon had risen, casting pale silver light over the uneven ground. As I stepped onto the porch, the crunch of gravel under my boots sounded louder than it should have, and I realized how silent everything else had become. The usual nighttime sounds, the rustling of small animals, the distant call of birds, had faded almost entirely. I followed the faint trail that led into the trees, careful to keep the cabin within sight. The forest felt different at night, alive in a way that wasn't pleasant. Every snapping twig or rustle of leaves seemed amplified, and I found myself constantly turning my head, expecting to see movement just beyond the edge of the path. It wasn't long before I noticed something unusual. A faint, irregular pattern in the dirt, footprints. I stopped immediately, my heart pounding. They weren't animal tracks, they were human. Not that it made sense. The cabin was remote. No one should be out here, and yet there they were, leading deeper into the woods. I hesitated, debating whether to follow them or turn back, but curiosity overpowered caution. I stepped off the trail, following the prints into the darkness. My lantern illuminated the immediate area, but left the forest around me in deep shadow. Every sound seemed louder, closer, and the feeling of being watched settled over me like a physical weight. The tracks led to a small clearing, one I hadn't noticed from the cabin. Moonlight spilled over uneven ground scattered with fallen branches and rocks. There was a faint smell in the air, metallic, sharp, and I realized it was blood. Not a lot, but enough to make me freeze. My heart jumped into my throat, and for a moment, I considered running back to the cabin. But then I saw something glinting in the moonlight, partially covered by leaves and dirt. A small knife, the blade smeared with dark red. My stomach churned, and I realized that whatever had passed through here wasn't alone or innocent. The rational part of my brain screamed to leave, but some part of me, the part that always needed to know the truth, kept me rooted to the spot. I backed away slowly, trying to retrace my steps when I heard it, a low, deliberate crunch behind me. I spun, lantern raised, but saw nothing. The forest was dark, the shadows long and twisted. I held my breath, trying to listen, and then heard it again, another step, heavier this time, moving closer. Panic surged through me. I bolted, not caring about the path, branches slapping my face and scratching my arms as I ran blindly through the trees. Every sense was on high alert. The sounds of pursuit were subtle at first, but unmistakable. Footsteps moving through the underbrush, snapping twigs in rhythm with my own frantic pace. I didn't dare look back. I ran for what felt like an eternity, tripping over roots and rocks, until I finally stumbled onto the main trail. My cabin was somewhere ahead, and I ran toward it, lungs burning, heart hammering. I could still hear the steps behind me, though they seemed to hesitate, then pick up again in a distorted rhythm, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, like whoever, or whatever, was following me was toying with me. I reached the cabin, slammed the door shut, and locked it, pressing my back against the wood, gasping for breath. The lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The forest outside seemed to hold its breath. I could hear nothing. The silence was overwhelming. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner, clutching the knife from the kitchen, every muscle tensed. The hours stretched endlessly, each minute heavier than the last. I listened to the wind, the leaves, the small sounds outside, every shadow in the room twisting into something dangerous in my mind. Dawn eventually came, though not with relief, only with exhaustion and the faintest sense of hope. The first light of morning allowed me to leave the cabin, stepping onto the porch and surveying the forest. It looked almost peaceful, the night's horrors hidden beneath the normality of daylight. But I knew better now. I could feel eyes in the trees, the memory of footsteps on the ground, and the cold glint of the knife in the clearing. I called the local ranger station from the cabin phone. The operator listened quietly as I explained the situation and the location. They said they would send someone, though it would take a while. The area was remote, and the trail was difficult. I packed my things methodically, taking extra care to leave nothing behind that could slow me down. I checked the locks, the windows, the doors, then stepped carefully down the porch steps. I kept the knife ready, every sense on high alert. The forest seemed normal in daylight, but the tracks in the dirt confirmed what I already knew. Someone had been here, someone dangerous, and they were likely still around. I moved cautiously, staying on the trail that led to the main road. Every sound, birds calling, leaves rustling, made me flinch, expecting the footsteps to return. Hours passed, and I eventually saw the first sign of civilization, a small road, the edge of a maintained path. Relief washed over me, but I stayed alert, scanning the tree line constantly. Eventually, a vehicle approached, kicking up dust, and I waved frantically. The driver slowed, pulled over, and I explained the situation, barely able to catch my breath. They radioed the ranger station, and soon a team arrived, walking carefully through the forest to check the area. The rangers confirmed what I had feared. The tracks belonged to someone who had been living rough in the woods, possibly squatting near the cabin or hunting along the trail. They found remnants of a fire, scattered supplies, and more evidence of knives and sharp tools hidden in the undergrowth. It was unnerving to think how close I had come to encountering them. The team cleared the area, ensuring the path and the cabin were safe, and they escorted me back to the road where a vehicle could take me to town. Sitting in the passenger seat, still tense and shaky, I realized how quickly the isolation of the forest could turn from peaceful solitude to genuine danger. I would never forget the night, the steps in the dark, the clearing, and the knife. I had wanted quiet and isolation, but the reality was far more terrifying. That day, I promised myself I would stick to more populated trails, no matter how beautiful the empty forest might seem. The safety of daylight and other people was worth every mile I would travel to reach it. The experience stayed with me, a constant reminder that even in the most seemingly serene places, danger can exist, hidden just beyond the edge of perception. The forest could look calm, the cabin inviting, but beneath it, there could be unseen threats watching, waiting, and the difference between life and death could be measured in a few quick, desperate steps. From then on, every time I saw dense woods or a remote trail, I remembered that night. The darkness, the footsteps, and the cold glint of the knife left behind, proof that the world outside civilization held dangers far more real than any story or imagination. I had been driving all day, winding through back roads that cut across empty fields and thick patches of forest. My plan was simple: spend a few nights camping in a remote area I had read about online. It was supposed to be quiet, untouched, far from towns or even other campers. I wanted the isolation, a chance to be completely alone. By the time I reached the small dirt path leading into the woods, the sun was dipping low, burning orange along the horizon. The forest ahead seemed to swallow the light, the trees so dense that they formed a wall of shadow. I parked my car on the side of the road and grabbed my pack, heavy with a tent, sleeping bag, and supplies for 3 days. The air smelled different here, earthy and damp, a mix of decaying leaves and pine. I had done solo trips before, but there was a strange tension in this forest, something I couldn't name. My boots crunched over the dry leaves as I walked along a barely visible trail, following a map I had printed weeks earlier. The first hour was uneventful. Birds were quiet, the wind rustling the branches occasionally, and the shadows of the trees stretched long as the sun fell behind them. I felt confident, almost exhilarated. There's something about being alone in the wild that makes you feel alive in a way you can't in the city. But as twilight deepened, a strange feeling settled in my chest. The woods felt too still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I set up my tent in a small clearing, a patch of ground soft with moss and pine needles. It was perfectly flat, hidden from the path, with thick trees forming a protective circle around it. I unpacked my supplies, built a small fire, and ate a simple meal of canned beans warmed over the flames. The air grew colder quickly once the sun disappeared, and the forest transformed. Shadows pooled between trees, and the sounds of nocturnal animals began to stir, rustling in the underbrush, distant snapping twigs. I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark sky above the tent mesh, watching stars appear between gaps in the canopy. My mind began to wander, imagining how long it would take for someone to find me if I got hurt out here, or how easily I could get lost. The wind shifted, and I could hear branches swaying far off, and then something closer. A subtle sound, almost imperceptible at first, heavy breathing. I froze, trying to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote. But the breaths were too deliberate, too steady. Not like an animal. I unzipped the tent slightly and peered into the darkness. My eyes adjusted slowly. I could make out shapes between the trees, long shadows that didn't move like the wind. The breathing got louder, closer. I strained to see, but nothing came into focus. My heart was pounding now, each beat loud in my ears. I considered packing up and leaving immediately, but the thought of stumbling through the forest in total darkness scared me more. I decided to wait, telling myself it was probably a hunter or someone else camping nearby. I stayed as still as I could, every muscle tense. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. It was impossible to tell. Every snap of a branch sounded like footsteps approaching. Finally, the breathing receded slightly, moving around the perimeter of my clearing. I thought I might have imagined it, but then a twig snapped very close to the tent. I could feel vibrations in the ground. Something was definitely moving just outside. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent enough to shine it outward. The beam cut through the black, illuminating nothing but trees. I swept the light slowly, inch by inch. Nothing. I almost convinced myself it had been a sound carried by the wind, or my imagination running wild. I unzipped the tent fully and stood, scanning the forest. Then I saw it, a figure. At first, it was just a dark silhouette, crouched low behind a tree, only partially visible. My breath caught. I froze. It didn't move immediately, but it didn't run either. It just stayed there, watching. My mind raced. Could it be someone lost? Could it be a criminal hiding out here? I didn't know, but I knew I needed to get to my car. Slowly, I moved backward toward my backpack, leaving a line of light on the figure. It stayed perfectly still. I grabbed my pack, shoving everything into it quickly. My fingers were trembling, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might be audible in the quiet. I swung my pack over my shoulder and started moving toward the path, staying low and trying to keep the flashlight off as much as possible. Every step I took, I thought I heard leaves crunch behind me, but I didn't dare turn around. I kept moving, faster now, jogging lightly. Then a shout erupted from deep in the woods. Not a yell, but a sudden, sharp exhale of human breath, almost animalistic in sound. My body went rigid. I froze, and then I heard the figure move, footsteps, quick and light, breaking branches. Panic surged. I ran. My flashlight bounced, illuminating tree trunks and patches of underbrush, but I didn't look back. The path was narrow, but I followed it, tripping over roots, scraping my hands and knees. The sound behind me was relentless, always moving, never slowing. I reached the clearing where I had parked my car, but the sight that greeted me froze my blood. The car door was open, the driver's side. Tire marks in the dirt suggested someone had approached the vehicle on foot. My stomach dropped. Whoever, or whatever, had been in the woods had been watching me. I fumbled with my keys, my hands slick with sweat, and finally managed to get the car started. The engine roared, and I sped off down the dirt road, keeping the lights low. I didn't stop until I reached a main road, miles away from the forest. The relief was immediate but shallow. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something emerge from the trees. Nothing came. Eventually, I found a small-town gas station, lit and occupied. I parked and stayed inside until sunrise, drinking coffee and trying to calm down. I called the local authorities to report the incident, but they seemed skeptical. The area was remote, they said. Sometimes travelers saw things they couldn't explain, usually harmless. But I knew what I had heard, what I had felt, the watching, the deliberate following. After that night, I never returned to that forest. I kept my gear, hoping I could someday use it for a safer trip, but the memory stayed with me, sharp and clear. I spent weeks replaying the events, trying to rationalize what had happened. Could it have been a lost hiker? An animal? I couldn't say. But the image of that crouched figure, the deliberate, heavy breathing, the footsteps in the dark, never left me. It was a stark reminder that isolation in nature is not always peaceful, and sometimes the danger comes not from the elements or wildlife, but from someone or something watching in the shadows, waiting. In time, I came to a cautious acceptance. I learned to respect the woods in a way I hadn't before, to always have an escape route, and never to underestimate the silence of a forest at night. I began carrying extra tools, a radio, and pepper spray on my trips, and I made a point of letting someone know my exact location. I couldn't change what had happened, but I could prepare to survive it if it ever occurred again. And sometimes late at night, when the wind rustles just right outside my window, I can still hear that faint echo of heavy breathing in the distance, and I remember how alone I really was. That night in the forest changed me. It taught me that fear isn't always about what you see. It's about what you know is there, just out of reach, waiting for you to make a mistake. And surviving it doesn't erase the memory, it sharpens it, etching it into your mind, so you never forget how fragile safety can be. I never camped in isolation again without taking every precaution I could, because I had learned the hard way that being alone in the wilderness is not just an adventure. It can be a test of every instinct you have, and sometimes the forest has eyes, and they're always watching. The first time I realized how alone I could be in the woods, I didn't notice it at first. It started as a normal hike, one of those weekends I used to escape from the city to somewhere quiet, where the air didn't smell of exhaust, and the only noise was birds or the wind through the trees. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, and led deeper into the forest than I had ever gone before. I didn't plan for it to be more than a day hike, but I had packed enough for a 2-day stay just in case. I liked the feeling of carrying too much, as though I was preparing for something I didn't understand yet. The sun was just rising when I left the trailhead, the light filtering through the canopy in golden beams that made the dew on the leaves sparkle. I walked slowly, taking in the quiet. Every step on the soft soil made a slight crunch, but other than that, it was silent. Occasionally, I would hear a bird call or the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful at first, almost soothing. As the morning wore on, the trail became less defined. There were places where I had to step over fallen logs or duck under low-hanging branches. The further I went, the less familiar the forest felt. It was still daytime, still safe in a sense, but I started to notice how quickly shadows formed between the trees. The kind of shadows that looked like they might move if you blinked. I stopped for a break near a small stream, crouching to drink. The water was cold and clear, and I could see tiny fish darting around in the shallow parts. I sat on a smooth rock, feeling the sunlight on my face, and for a moment, it was like the world had paused. But then I realized I didn't hear anything beyond the babble of the water. No birds, no wind, no animals. Just the stream. My stomach tightened. It was a small thing, but I noticed it. Normally there would be background noise, even in the middle of the forest, but here, it was unnervingly quiet. I packed up and kept walking. The trail became more like a path, barely worn, and at one point, I had to climb over a fallen tree that blocked the way. That's when I noticed I had gone further than I had intended. The landmarks I thought I recognized weren't matching up. A ridge I thought I'd pass by was now in front of me instead of behind. I wasn't sure how long I had been walking, but the sun was starting to dip lower in the sky. Panic started to creep in, the kind that whispers at the edges of your mind. I knew I should turn back, but everything looked the same. Trees stretched out endlessly, and there was no sign of the trail I had been following. I tried to retrace my steps, looking for the stream I had rested by, but the forest seemed to swallow it. As twilight approached, the air grew colder. I was still several miles from the trailhead, I realized, and I hadn't even eaten much during the day. My backpack was heavy, my legs were sore, and every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I knew I wasn't alone out here. It was a simple, primal awareness. You feel it when you're deep in the woods, far from anything human. Something was watching, or at least, the thought of it was enough to make my heart race. I found a small clearing, and decided I would camp for the night. I didn't have a tent, only a tarp and a sleeping bag. The ground was uneven, full of rocks and roots, but I managed to clear a spot just big enough to lay down. I built a small fire using dry branches I found nearby. The first sparks caught, and the flames cast flickering shadows around me. The fire made me feel slightly safer, but it also drew attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Night in the forest is different from night in the city. The sounds are sharper, closer. Every branch snapping, every leaf rustling, every distant animal cry was amplified in the darkness. I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. I tried to keep the fire alive, adding small pieces of wood whenever it started to die down, but my eyes kept darting to the shadows. There was a smell too faint, earthy, like wet soil and something else I couldn't place. It made my stomach turn. I finally lay down in my sleeping bag, trying to rest. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself the sounds were just raccoons or deer, but my body didn't believe it. Every few minutes, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the firelight, a flicker of something that didn't belong. I didn't move, didn't breathe too loudly. I just waited. Hours passed. The fire died down to embers, and I had to rekindle it a couple of times. Around midnight, the wind picked up. The trees swayed, and the branches creaked above me. I heard something heavy moving through the underbrush. It wasn't a small animal. This was bigger. Slow, deliberate steps that made the ground tremble slightly. I froze. My mind raced. I could not see it, but I could feel it. The weight of it. I knew if it wanted to, it could crush me without warning. I remembered the small knife in my pocket and clutched it. My hands shook. I didn't make a sound. Whatever it was, it stayed just at the edge of my vision, in the dark. Then it stopped. Silence again. But it wasn't peaceful. It was waiting, like it knew I was vulnerable. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't think clearly. All I could do was wait for the first light. Morning came slowly, the sun's rays piercing through the trees. I could see more clearly now. The ground around my campsite was disturbed. Branches were broken, and there were footprints in the soft soil. Large, wide, and deep. I realized with a sick feeling that I had been sleeping in the middle of a predator's path. I had no idea if it had been a bear, a wildcat, or something else. I just knew I had been lucky. I packed up quickly, leaving nothing behind, and tried to remember the way back. I marked my path as I went, breaking small branches and stacking rocks. It took hours, but eventually I stumbled onto a familiar part of the trail. Relief flooded me, but I didn't slow down. I walked quickly, keeping my eyes on the shadows, listening to the wind, the birds, anything that told me I was leaving. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was exhausted, my legs shaking, my clothes torn, and my backpack lighter because I had left some supplies behind. I drove home in a daze, unable to stop thinking about what could have happened if I had fallen asleep for a minute longer, or if the fire had gone out sooner. It took me a long time to stop seeing the forest as just trees and paths. Every time I close my eyes, I see those shadows, the movement just beyond the light. The way the forest can make you feel completely alone, even when you are breathing the same air you've breathed your whole life. I don't go hiking in remote woods anymore. I don't need to. The memory of that night is enough to remind me that nature doesn't care if you survive or not. It just is. And sometimes that is terrifying enough. Even now, when I tell the story, my hands shake. Not because I'm remembering the walk or the climb, but because I remember what it felt like to be powerless, to feel something watching and waiting, knowing I could not see it and could not fight it. That lesson, the understanding of how small and fragile I am in the vastness of the woods, has stayed with me. And I carry it everywhere, in the way I walk through forests, in the way I lock my doors at night, in the way I respect the quiet and the darkness. I survived, and that was enough. I made it out alive, but I will never forget the night I realized just how easy it could have been for the forest to claim me, and how quickly the line between calm and terror can vanish when you are truly alone. It started as a normal summer weekend. I had decided to go camping alone, wanting some time away from everything. I packed my small backpack with just the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, a few canned foods, water, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I wanted simplicity, nothing complicated, just me and the forest. I drove for a few hours, following winding roads that cut through rolling hills, eventually reaching a dirt path that led deep into a wooded area. There was a small clearing there, surrounded by tall pines and oaks, with soft moss covering parts of the ground. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and leaves. I could hear distant birds and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, where the trees formed a natural barrier. I liked that I could see most of the open space in front of me, while having the safety of the dense forest behind. I made a small fire pit using stones I found nearby and gathered dry wood to start a fire. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, and shadows stretched long across the clearing. Everything seemed calm, peaceful even. As the fire crackled, I ate a small dinner and watched the flames dance. Gradually, the forest grew darker, the light fading until the fire became my only source of illumination. That's when I first noticed it, the feeling that I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle. The hair on the back of my neck would rise, and I'd hear a faint snapping of twigs or a soft brush against leaves. But when I turned my head, nothing was there. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the forest at night is alive with sounds I don't notice during the day. Night settled fully, and I crawled into my tent. I was lying on my sleeping bag, staring at the tent's ceiling, listening to the fire's dying crackle, when I heard something more distinct. It was deliberate, the slow crunch of something moving through the leaves toward my clearing. My heart began to pound, and I stayed still, hoping it would pass. The sound stopped for a moment, then I could hear breathing, low and heavy, coming from the edge of the clearing. It wasn't animal breathing. I've camped a lot, and I know deer, raccoons, and even bears have distinct sounds, but this was different. Human. Someone or something was out there. I unzipped the tent slightly and shined my flashlight toward the noise, but all I could see were shadows and tree trunks. The light caught nothing, and whatever was out there must have noticed, because the breathing stopped. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, faintly, I heard movement again. Footsteps, careful but purposeful, moving along the tree line. I realized my fire was almost out. I scrambled to relight it, my hands shaking. Sparks caught, flames flared, and the shadows around me seemed to shrink back. Whatever was there retreated, but I could still hear leaves being brushed aside deeper in the woods. Sleep was impossible after that. I sat by the fire, flashlight in hand, scanning every inch of the dark. Hours passed like minutes. Every sound made me tense, an owl hooting, the wind shifting in the branches, a branch snapping under what I swore was a deliberate step. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was someone else camping nearby, someone who decided to walk through the woods in the dark. But nothing in the clearing suggested another campsite. No tent, no fire, no footprints visible in the soft earth. Around 2 a.m., I heard it clearly, a low, deliberate voice calling out, just once from the trees. It wasn't words I could understand, just a sound meant to startle. I froze, holding my breath, listening. Then came another step, closer this time. I realized the figure wasn't moving along the tree line. They were moving directly toward me. My body went rigid. I thought about running, but if I left the fire, I'd be completely blind in the forest. I grabbed my small camping knife and a flashlight and slowly rose, keeping my eyes on the edge of the tree line. The figure emerged, finally visible in the firelight. It was a man tall, wearing dark clothes that blended with the shadows. His face was obscured, but I could see the outline of him clearly against the fire. He stopped just at the tree line, not advancing further, just watching. My mind raced, thinking about self-defense, calling the police, trying to remember if anyone had cell signal here. I checked my phone, no service. I realized I had only one option: get to the car. I had parked about a quarter-mile down the dirt path. If I could make it there, lock the doors, and drive away, I'd be safe. I quietly backed toward the trees opposite the path, keeping low, trying to make as little noise as possible. The man didn't move, just stood there like a predator waiting. I held my breath as I stepped on a branch, praying it wouldn't snap. It did, a small crack that sounded loud in the still night. The man's head turned sharply, and I froze again. For a moment, I thought he might run toward me. Then, slowly, he began moving again, parallel to the clearing, keeping the trees between us. I seized the chance and bolted, running hard, my feet pounding the dirt, heart hammering so loudly I thought he could hear it. I didn't look back, just ran, dodging low branches, trying not to trip over roots. The flashlight I carried barely illuminated the path, and I had to use one hand to push branches away from my face. Every few seconds, I thought I heard him behind me, but I never dared to look. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw my car's headlights reflecting faintly in the darkness. I sprinted the last few meters, throwing myself into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. My hands were shaking violently. I locked the doors, turned the engine on, and peeled out of the dirt path as fast as I dared. My headlights cut through the trees, but when I glanced in the rearview mirror, the man was gone. It was as if he had melted into the night. I drove for hours, sticking to well-lit roads, and stopping only when I knew I was near towns with people around. The sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the roads, and only then did I begin to feel a little relief. I thought about the man, about how close I had come to him, and I realized that in situations like that, luck and presence of mind are everything. I could have been caught if I had frozen or hesitated. When I got home, I called the local sheriff and reported the incident. They took my statement seriously, but had no patrols in the area that night, and no one else had reported anything. I went back to the campsite during daylight a week later, cautiously. Everything was quiet, peaceful, just like any normal forest. No footprints, no signs of anyone else being there. It was as if the night's terror had never existed, except for the memory etched in my mind. I still think about that night. The fear, the silence, the sense that someone was watching me, it lingers. I've camped alone since, but I never go anywhere without making sure there's cell signal, extra light, and a clear escape route. I learned that the forest can be peaceful and beautiful, but it can also hide dangers that aren't obvious until they are right in front of you. I survived because I kept moving, stayed aware, and trusted my instincts. And every time I drive past that dirt path, I remember the cold eyes in the darkness, and I make a promise to never let my guard down in the wilderness again. I remember the first time I realized just how unprepared I was for the kind of isolation the wilderness could bring. It wasn't like the stories you hear in movies or the thrill-seeking tales people tell at campfires. This was different, quiet, subtle, and slowly creeping into every sense until it wrapped itself around you, leaving you aware of every small sound, every shift in the wind, every uncertain step you took. I had been planning the hike for months, mapping out the trail from the main road into a remote section of forest that wasn't on most maps. The kind of place where cell service disappears halfway through the drive and the nearest house is miles away. The path started easily enough. Fallen leaves crunched under my boots, and the sunlight came in patches through the canopy, creating moving patterns on the forest floor. I carried my pack with the usual essentials: water, a small stove, food enough for 2 days, a flashlight, and an extra battery. I had a compass, of course, but I didn't really need it for the first stretch. The trail was wide, marked with paint on the trees, and the air smelled clean and earthy, almost sweet after a night of rain. By the time I reached the clearing where I intended to camp, the sun was just starting to dip behind the tree-line. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that makes your chest tighten because you feel like you might not deserve it, standing there alone. The clearing was small, circular, and lined by thick pines. I set up my tent, layered the tarp underneath, and started a fire in the ring of stones someone had left behind. The fire was comforting, its warmth and crackling sound making the approaching darkness feel manageable. I cooked a small meal and ate slowly, watching the shadows grow, stretching long fingers across the clearing. Once it was dark, I crawled into the tent, zipped it up tightly, and lay on my sleeping bag. The wind moved through the trees, rustling leaves and sending faint whispers into the tent fabric. I tried to read a book, but the words seemed distant, like my mind was somewhere else. Every snap of a twig outside made me tense, and every gust of wind sounded almost like footsteps. I tried to remind myself that the forest was full of harmless animals. Deer, rabbits, maybe a fox. Nothing that could hurt me. But the isolation made every ordinary sound feel amplified, as if the forest was aware of my presence and observing, judging. Around midnight, I woke to a low, sharp sound, like a branch breaking but not quite. It came from the edge of the clearing, the part where the trees grew thick and the shadows pooled. I froze, listening. The sound repeated, this time accompanied by another noise, heavier, deliberate. Something was moving out there, just beyond the light of my fire. My first thought was a deer or a wild boar, but then I remembered the tracks I had seen earlier on the trail. Large, spread-out prints, deeper than any deer's. A mountain lion maybe, or a coyote. I told myself to stay calm. I told myself the fire would keep it away. I told myself I was safe. But my pulse wouldn't slow. The noises grew closer. Not fast, but deliberate, like something was circling, testing the perimeter, listening. I tried to stay still, hoping it would move on. Then the sound of heavy breathing reached me, low and uneven, through the thin tent walls. I swallowed hard and strained my ears. Every instinct screamed to run, but I was frozen in place, the thought of opening the tent and stepping into the unknown paralyzing me. The breathing stopped for a moment, and then it started again, a few feet closer, almost at the edge of my firelight. I realized I had to make a decision. Staying in the tent meant waiting and hoping. Leaving meant exposing myself. I grabbed my flashlight, knowing it wouldn't do much, but at least give me something to see, and slowly unzipped the tent. The cool night air hit me immediately. My fire cast shadows that danced among the trees, but nothing moved. I pointed the light toward the thickest part of the forest, trying to catch any reflection of eyes, any motion. Silence. I decided to move toward the car. The thought of being in an enclosed metal box, with doors that could lock, gave me some comfort. I took small, careful steps, scanning every shadow, every rustle of leaves. About halfway through the clearing, I saw it, a silhouette crouched low, barely visible in the trees, but unmistakably there. Large, sinewy, its head turning slowly as if assessing me. My heart lurched. I froze, counting every shallow breath. The animal didn't move aggressively, didn't charge, but I knew one wrong move could provoke it. I slowly backed away, not turning my back, keeping the flashlight trained on the silhouette. My foot hit a rock, making a loud scrape across the forest floor. The creature stiffened, then slowly slipped back into the trees, leaving only the sound of its movement through leaves and branches. I didn't wait to see where it went. I ran. My legs pumped harder than they ever had before. I didn't stop until the car was in sight, headlights reflecting off the windshield and hood. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a long time, chest heaving, hands shaking. I realized how small and vulnerable I was, how easily the forest could overwhelm me. I drove slowly back to the main road, keeping my lights on high and scanning the tree line constantly, expecting to see eyes following me. Nothing appeared, and eventually, I reached a stretch where other cars passed by, headlights washing over the road and making me feel almost normal again. The next day, I returned with another hiker, this time sticking to the marked trails and daylight hours. We explored the same clearing, looking for signs of what I had seen. We found tracks, enormous claw marks on the bark of some trees, and scat that confirmed my suspicion. A mountain lion, large and old enough to dominate that section of the forest. I realized then that my fear had been justified. This wasn't a story, it wasn't exaggeration. It was real, and if I hadn't kept my wits and moved carefully, it could have ended badly. From that experience, I learned how fragile the boundary between safety and danger is in the wilderness. I also learned to respect it in a way I never had before. I continued hiking, but always with caution, always prepared, always aware of my surroundings. The forest was beautiful, and I still loved being in it, but I never took it for granted again. Every rustle, every shadow, every distant sound became part of the landscape of survival. Even now, I can close my eyes and remember that night, the way the wind shifted, the smell of pine and damp earth, the cold bite of fear in my chest, and the sight of those glowing eyes in the dark. It taught me something simple but vital. In the wild, you are never truly alone, and every step must be measured, every decision deliberate. The ending of that night was survival, but survival wasn't luck. It was awareness, patience, and respect for the world you step into. I came home, but a part of me stayed in that forest, changed forever, carrying with me the lesson that danger doesn't announce itself with a roar. Sometimes it simply waits, patient and silent, until you notice it. And that night I noticed. I remember the first night like it was burned into my memory. I had decided to take a short trip into the mountains alone, hoping to escape the constant noise of the city. I thought the isolation would be peaceful, a break from the endless hum of traffic, people, and deadlines. I packed my car with just the essentials, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a backpack with a few days' worth of food and water, a flashlight, and a basic first aid kit. I avoided bringing anything that would make me a burden to myself. No generator, no heavy gear, just the bare necessities. The road wound its way up into the forest, narrow and steep, flanked by dense trees that blocked out the sun as I drove. By the time I reached the clearing I had picked for camping, it was late afternoon. The air was crisp, almost cold despite it being summer, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine. I parked my car at the edge of the clearing and stepped out, feeling the soft soil give slightly beneath my boots. The sun was already low, casting long shadows through the trees, and the quiet was almost overwhelming. No birds sang. No wind stirred the branches. Only the faint rustle of leaves under my own feet broke the stillness. I set up my tent slowly, making sure it was anchored well into the ground because I knew mountain winds could come up without warning. I unpacked my food and water, making a small, tidy pile at the side, and I even prepared a small fire pit with rocks I found nearby, imagining the crackle of flames and warmth I'd need once night fell. As I started walking a short distance from my campsite to collect firewood, the forest seemed to grow heavier, the shadows darker. Every step I took made a soft crunch on the fallen leaves, but sometimes I thought I could hear something else. A twig snapping under weight heavier than mine, a faint shuffle somewhere just beyond the corner of my vision. I kept telling myself it was just the wind, just the forest settling, just my imagination. But even as I reassured myself, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. My skin prickled, and my heart rate went up slightly. I tried to focus on the wood in front of me, thick branches and dry logs that would make the fire last. But the shadows seemed to shift even when I stopped moving. By the time I returned to my camp with a modest pile of wood, the sun had disappeared completely, leaving the forest in shades of gray and black. I built a small fire, the flames providing a circle of light that kept the surrounding darkness at bay. Sitting close to it, I ate some cold food, listening to the occasional pop from burning wood, and tried to convince myself everything was normal. The forest should have been peaceful, beautiful, even comforting, but the hair on the back of my neck remained rigid. Every snap of a branch, every whisper of wind through the pines made me tense, made me grip the edge of my backpack. After eating, I decided to explore a bit more before sleeping, hoping to tire myself out so I could rest easier. I moved slowly, using my flashlight sparingly to preserve batteries. The beam of light cut through the darkness in a thin cylinder, and everything beyond it was black and unknowable. At first, it was just trees, moss, and rocks, but then I started noticing the way the forest floor seemed uneven, how certain areas were trampled as if someone, or something, had passed through recently. Leaves were crushed in patterns that weren't natural, and I could see faint impressions in the soil that looked like footprints. Too big to be mine, not human, not animal in any recognizable way. My stomach sank. I told myself to calm down, that maybe it was just deer or bears, but the tracks didn't match anything I had seen in wildlife guides. And then I noticed something else, the silence. In the city, even at night, there is background noise, cars, distant conversations, sirens. But here, there was nothing except the sound of my own breathing and the faint crackle of my flashlight batteries. I realized I hadn't heard an animal sound since I'd arrived. No owls, no coyotes, no insects. That absence made the darkness feel thicker, more oppressive. I decided to return to the fire and settle in for the night. As I walked back, my flashlight flickered and went out, leaving me in pitch darkness for a few seconds. My fingers fumbled for the spare bulb in my pocket, and when I finally got it to work again, the beam illuminated a figure, or what I thought was a figure, standing at the far edge of the clearing. I froze. It wasn't moving, just there, completely still, blending almost perfectly with the trees. I couldn't tell if it was a person, an animal, or some trick of shadows. My pulse thumped violently in my ears, my hands shook, and I considered running, but my brain forced me to stay calm. I rationalized that it was probably a fallen tree, or a rock that looked like something else. But then I saw movement. A slow, deliberate step, shifting closer toward the clearing. My mind refused to believe it. I had told myself countless times I was imagining things, but the soft crunch of leaves beneath heavy weight confirmed it. Something, or someone, was approaching. I backed up slowly toward the fire, hoping the light would act as a deterrent. But my fire wasn't enough to illuminate the distance. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give away my position. I grabbed my backpack, knowing that I needed to have an escape plan. I didn't want to run blindly, so I edged closer to my car, keeping low, making sure I was behind trees as much as possible. The sound of the steps followed, but they seemed uneven, deliberate, testing the terrain, as if the person, or creature, was familiar with the forest. When I finally reached the car, I dropped everything inside and jumped in, locking the doors. My breathing was ragged, my hands cold and clammy, and I sat for several minutes just listening. The steps had stopped, but I could hear something else. The low rustle of movement circling the clearing, slow and methodical. I debated what to do. I could stay in the car, but I knew that wouldn't last forever if this was a human threat. My best option was to drive back down the mountain, back toward people, toward safety. I started the car, careful not to make too much noise, and slowly backed out of the small clearing. My headlights caught movement in the forest just at the edge of the road, a shadow darting between trees. I slammed my foot on the gas, my tires skidding slightly on loose gravel, and drove faster than I had on the way up, the road twisting and turning, every curve a new potential hazard. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a moment, I thought I saw headlights following me, but there was nothing. The road descended steeply, and my headlights illuminated the forest floor in fleeting snapshots. Every time a tree cast a shadow across the road, it looked like someone standing there, waiting. I forced myself to keep going, hands gripping the wheel, eyes straining to see past the darkness. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, I reached the paved road leading out of the forest. My fear didn't subside until I passed a small town with lights still on, cars parked along streets, people moving about. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station, where I pulled in and locked the car doors again. I sat there for a long time, shaking, trying to calm down, drinking water, telling myself I had survived. The next day, I returned with a friend and a local park ranger. They showed me areas where hikers had reported strange tracks before, similar to what I had seen. Old footprints, large and irregular, human-like but not entirely human, had been spotted throughout the area. Some said it was poachers, some said it was just imagination, but the ranger confirmed that the terrain made it easy for someone to remain hidden, move silently, and watch campsites without being seen. He showed me the safer trails, the proper precautions, and we walked the perimeter of my previous campsite. The footprints and disturbances I had noticed were still visible, faint in the dirt but unmistakable. The forest had claimed its secrets, and I was glad to have left without getting closer to them. I never camped alone in that area again. I still go into the mountains, but now I make sure I have company, backup, and a plan. The experience taught me that isolation has a weight, that darkness can hide things far worse than imagination, and that sometimes being careful and aware is the only way to survive. The forest is beautiful, but it is also mercilessly real, indifferent to fear, and it can be terrifying if you underestimate it. Even now, years later, I can remember the smell of wet pine, the sound of leaves under unseen feet, and the hollow feeling of standing alone while something watches you from just beyond the light. I carry that memory with me, a reminder that reality is often scarier than any story, and that survival is in the details, the careful observation, the decisions made in panic, and the courage to leave when the danger is real. The fire pit I left behind is still there if someone ever goes back to that clearing, but I wouldn't. The smell of charred wood is faint, the shadows remain long, and I know now that some parts of the forest are not meant for anyone to linger. I learned how fragile we are alone, how quickly peace can turn into fear, and how vital it is to respect the terrain and the unknown. That trip, that night, changed how I view solitude, how I prepare for wilderness, and how I recognize the difference between the quiet of nature and the quiet of being hunted. Even writing it down, remembering the tension, the paranoia, the instinct to survive, brings a chill. But I also remember the relief of driving back to light, to civilization, to safety. The ending was clear. I survived because I stayed alert, trusted my instincts, and didn't let curiosity or pride keep me in danger. And that lesson stays with me every time I pack a bag for the mountains. The night was colder than I expected when I arrived at the edge of the forest, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and makes your teeth chatter even when you move. I had planned this camping trip for weeks, wanting to get away from everything for a few days, to be completely alone with just the wilderness around me. I parked my car on the narrow dirt road and stepped out, the headlights cutting through the darkness, but only barely reaching the start of the trees. The wind rustled through the branches, carrying the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. I could hear the faint sound of a stream somewhere deeper in the woods, and for a moment, it felt peaceful. But as soon as I started walking toward the clearing where I planned to set up my tent, a strange tightness settled in my chest, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how much I told myself it was just the quiet playing tricks on me. I carried my backpack, heavy with supplies, and a small bag with food and water. I chose a clearing that seemed open enough, a small circle surrounded by thick pines. I set up my tent as quickly as I could, wanting the security of walls between me and whatever could be out there. By the time I finished, the sun had completely disappeared, leaving only a deep, unbroken darkness. The forest around me was alive with sounds. The snap of a branch, the scuttle of some small creature, the distant hoot of an owl. Each sound made me jump, my pulse quickening with every rustle in the underbrush. I tried to eat dinner, but I couldn't focus. Every time I lifted my spoon, I froze, thinking I heard someone or something moving near the tree-line. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, normal animals that didn't care about me. But it didn't feel normal. The forest felt aware. I decided to explore a little before it got completely dark. I grabbed my flashlight, the beam narrow but cutting through the night, just enough to see roots and fallen branches. I moved slowly, listening to the crunch of leaves under my boots. The further I went, the quieter the forest became, almost eerily so. Then I noticed something strange, the footprints. At first, I thought it was just animal tracks, but as I followed them, it became clear they were not from any animal I recognized. They were too large and seemed to shift in size, as if whoever, or whatever, made them was walking in a strange, uneven pattern. I stopped and looked around, shining my flashlight over the ground, but I saw nothing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a cold sweat ran down my spine. I wanted to turn back, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. I had to know what was making these tracks. I followed the prints deeper into the forest, past the clearing where I had left my tent behind. The trees grew thicker, and the underbrush became harder to move through. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and I cursed under my breath, checking the batteries. When I looked up, I realized I was completely disoriented. Everything looked the same shadows, the same twisted trees, the same patches of moonlight filtering through the canopy. I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked wrong. Panic began to rise in my chest, my breaths coming faster. I told myself to stay calm, to just pick one path and keep moving, but fear had a way of twisting every thought, making everything seem worse than it was. Then I heard it, a low, wet sound like heavy breathing coming from behind a large pine. I froze, straining to see, but the darkness swallowed everything beyond the beam of my flashlight. My hands trembled, gripping the flashlight as I slowly stepped backward, trying not to make any noise. The sound moved, sliding through the trees, and I realized it was following me. My stomach dropped, and adrenaline surged through me. I turned and ran, tripping over roots and sliding down a small slope, my flashlight bouncing ahead of me. The sounds of movement followed me, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, but always behind me. I didn't dare look back, knowing I didn't want to see what was there. I ran until I could no longer hear my own footsteps over the sound of my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Eventually, I stumbled into a small creek, the cold water soaking my shoes and pants. I paused, trying to catch my breath, and for a moment, I thought I had lost whatever was following me. I leaned against a tree, my mind racing. I had to get back to my tent, to something familiar, before it was too late. I tried to calm myself, whispering that it was probably just a deer or some other animal, but the sound I had heard was nothing like a deer, and it hadn't been alone. I moved cautiously along the creek, trying to keep track of the way I had come, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly. Every sound made me jump, the snap of a branch, a rustle in the leaves, the splash of water as something moved ahead of me. I was soaked, cold, and exhausted, but I kept going, driven by the need to survive. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the faint outline of my tent through the trees. Relief surged through me, and I ran the last few yards, diving inside and zipping the door closed. I collapsed on the ground, shivering, listening to the forest around me. The breathing had stopped, but I didn't dare open the tent to check. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, flashlight in hand, eyes scanning the darkness beyond the tent walls. Morning came slowly, the sunlight piercing the trees in thin, golden streaks. I stepped outside cautiously, scanning the clearing for any signs of movement. The footprints from last night were gone, washed away by dew and the movement of small animals. I packed up my gear quickly, my hands still shaking, and decided to leave. As I walked back to my car, I stayed alert, watching the shadows between the trees. Every snap of a branch made me jump, every bird call set my nerves on edge. I didn't stop until I reached the dirt road, the sound of my car engine finally cutting through the tense silence. I drove away without looking back, the forest fading in my rearview mirror. Later, safe at home, I thought about what I had experienced. The fear I felt in the forest was raw and real, and I couldn't explain the footprints or the heavy breathing that had followed me. I realized that the wilderness was unpredictable and that animals, or perhaps people, could be closer and more dangerous than you expected. The forest was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving, and it demanded respect. I knew I would never forget that night, and that I would always be cautious when venturing into places where you are truly alone, where no one can hear you, and where the darkness hides more than just shadows. Even now, months later, I find myself double-checking the locks on my doors, imagining the forest at night, and remembering the sound that followed me. I learned that fear can sharpen your senses, but it can also trap you in your own mind. And sometimes the most terrifying moments are not about what you see, but what you hear, and what you know could be out there, just beyond your sight. The memory of that night stays with me, a constant reminder of how fragile our sense of safety is, and how quickly it can be stripped away when we are truly alone in the wilderness. I remember the first time I truly understood what it meant to feel completely alone in a place that seemed familiar but was suddenly hostile. It happened in the late summer, when the days were long, the sun sat low in the sky by 6, and the fields behind my house were filled with the dull hum of crickets. I had decided to go hiking in the hills, just beyond the farmland. It wasn't far from my home, maybe 20 minutes on foot, but the trails were rough and mostly unmarked. I liked it that way. There were no people to crowd me, no sounds except the wind through the tall grass and the occasional crow. I packed a small bag with a water bottle, a snack, a flashlight, and my phone. I didn't expect to be gone long. The first hour was easy. The path was a worn line through the overgrown grass, littered with rocks and the occasional fallen branch. The hills weren't steep, but they rose in slow, rolling waves, and by the time I had climbed one ridge, I could see the next one stretching off into the distance. The sun was warm on my skin, and the scent of dry earth and wildflowers filled the air. I stopped on a small rise to catch my breath and take in the view, feeling the satisfaction of being alone with the land. It was around mid-afternoon when I first noticed something odd. I had just started down a slope toward a shallow valley, and the tall grass brushed against my knees. A sudden rustle made me freeze. I spun around, expecting to see a rabbit or maybe a small fox, but there was nothing. The grass shifted, the wind moved through it, and for a moment I shook my head and laughed at myself for being jumpy. I kept walking, but I started to notice that the sounds of the hillside didn't feel right. The birds weren't singing. The wind had a hollow edge to it, as if it was moving through empty spaces that weren't there before. I decided to push on because I was curious. There was a stream I wanted to reach that I had seen from the top of the last ridge. It shouldn't take more than 20 minutes, I thought. The ground became rougher, strewn with rocks and hidden holes, and I found myself stepping carefully. The slope was steeper than I expected, and I lost track of time, noticing only the light shifting as the sun began to sink. Shadows grew longer, folding into the crevices of the hills. The stream should have been close, but I didn't see it yet. Then I heard it, a low, crunching sound, like someone walking over dry leaves and twigs. I froze. My heart thumped in my chest. I scanned the valley, but there was nothing. No movement. I told myself it was probably an animal, a deer, maybe a fox, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. I crouched behind a rock and waited, straining my ears. The crunching stopped. I tried to convince myself to keep going. The light was fading, but not too fast. I could make it to the stream, and then back to the main trail before dark. I stepped carefully down the slope, testing each stone. Then the sound returned, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't a single set of steps. There were multiple sets, moving in a pattern I didn't understand. Something in the rhythm was off, too calculated. My stomach twisted. I wanted to call someone, but the phone in my pocket showed no signal. Panic began to rise, but I tried to suppress it. I focused on the terrain. The valley floor was uneven, scattered with bushes and rocks. I stayed low, using the cover of the vegetation, and moved quietly. The crunching followed, always just beyond the reach of my eyes. I slowed down, crouching, and tried to make myself smaller, hoping whatever it was would pass. The valley narrowed, and I realized I had walked further than I intended. The map I had studied in my head was no help. The hills had blended together, and I couldn't tell which ridge I had come from. My water was almost gone, and I was sweating from fear and exertion. Shadows now stretched long and black across the land, the sun almost gone behind the ridge. Then I saw it, a figure crouched low behind a bush, moving slowly in my direction. I froze. It was human-shaped, but it didn't behave like a human. The movements were deliberate, careful, patient. I ducked lower, my mind racing. I had no weapon. I had no way to defend myself if it came closer. The rational part of my brain screamed that I should run, but the other part, some deep, instinctive part, told me that running now would make me visible, that I had to stay out of sight. I stayed crouched, trying to measure the distance. Every step it took was calculated. The figure paused, almost sensing me. My heart pounded in my ears. I could hear the faint shuffle of fabric and the soft scrape of shoes against rock. My mind ran through every possibility. What if it wasn't alone? What if it was waiting for me to move? The shadows grew darker, the valley folding in on itself. I noticed a narrow path between two ridges that led upward. It was steep, almost vertical in places, but if I could reach the top, I might see the road beyond. I inched toward it, moving slowly, carefully placing each foot. The figure mirrored my movements, stopping whenever I stopped. My pulse was deafening. I had to make a decision. Then I saw a fallen tree lying across the path. It was heavy and would slow anyone who tried to follow me. I took a deep breath, gripped the edge of the trunk, and pushed myself over. The figure didn't follow immediately, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. I scrambled up the slope, using every rock and root to pull myself higher. My legs burned, but adrenaline drove me. At the top of the ridge, I paused, gasping for air. Below me, the valley stretched dark and empty. I didn't see the figure anymore, but I didn't dare assume it had gone. I kept moving, heading toward a line of trees I remembered near the far edge of the hills. From there, the main road would be visible. My legs ached, my hands were scraped, but the thought of safety kept me going. Finally, I broke through the last ridge and saw the road. Headlights glimmered in the distance. Relief flooded me. I ran down the slope toward the road, stumbling over rocks and dirt, my clothes torn and dusty. The car slowed as I emerged, the driver staring at me with surprise. I didn't stop. I threw myself into the passenger seat, slammed the door, and we drove off. The figure never appeared again, and when I looked back, the valley seemed peaceful, empty, almost normal. That night, safe in my room, I replayed everything over and over. I couldn't explain who or what had been there, why it had followed me, or how close I had come to being trapped. I knew one thing. I had learned how fragile the sense of safety could be, how quickly the familiar could become hostile, and how important it was to trust instinct when every rational thought failed. I never went back to that valley, and I never hiked alone in unmarked hills again. But I remembered every detail, every sound, every shadow, because it was proof that fear, when real, is never abstract. It stays with you. It teaches you to move carefully, to see beyond what is visible, and to survive when the world suddenly becomes dangerous in ways you cannot predict. Even years later, whenever I drive past the hills, I catch myself looking for the shadows, the crunching of leaves, the figure that might still be out there. I never see it, and yet the memory is vivid. It shaped the way I move through the world, the way I think about isolation, about safety, about the strange quiet moments that can turn terrifying without warning. It taught me that survival is about observation, patience, and timing, and that sometimes the simplest act, like climbing over a fallen tree at the right moment, can mean the difference between safety and something far worse. I remember the first time I really understood how isolated a place could feel. It was late summer, and I had decided to spend a few nights alone camping in a stretch of wilderness I'd heard about but never explored. The forest was dense, older than anything I could imagine, and it stretched for miles in every direction without a single trail marking the way. I had mapped out a rough plan on paper, but I knew the real world rarely obeyed lines drawn with a pencil. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun dipping low and casting long shadows through the trees. The air was thick with the smell of earth and decaying leaves, and each step I took crunched over layers of dry foliage, announcing my presence to anything that might be watching. I set up my tent in a small clearing near a brook. The water gurgled over rocks, clear and cool, and I filled my bottles, feeling relief that I wouldn't have to ration what I carried. Around me, the forest rose like walls of green and brown, thick trunks and undergrowth preventing any easy escape or view beyond a few meters. Birds called somewhere high above, but the deeper sounds of the forest, the rustling of small animals in the brush, the faint crack of a branch snapping, were far closer to the ground. I liked to think I could handle this solitude, that the silence wouldn't get to me, but the forest had a different way of speaking than cities did, and it didn't care who I was. By early evening, I had a fire going. I collected wood carefully, selecting dry branches that would crackle and burn brightly, filling the clearing with warmth and light. I sat back against a log, eating a small meal I had packed, but I kept my eyes on the tree line. There was a movement, subtle and quick, but deliberate. At first, I convinced myself it was a deer, perhaps grazing nearby and watching me as cautiously as I was watching it. Then I noticed the way the branches bent slightly, as if something larger was stepping carefully, with awareness of my fire. My heart picked up, not with fear at first, but with an alertness I hadn't felt before, the kind that makes you notice every snap, every hiss of wind. Night fell, and with it, a heavy darkness that seemed to press down through the canopy. I extinguished the fire, leaving just enough embers to keep me oriented. That's when I started hearing it. The subtle crunch of feet on dry leaves, moving in and out of the shadows beyond the clearing. I stayed very still, listening, counting breaths, trying to rationalize. It could be a coyote, or maybe a raccoon. Maybe I was imagining it. But the sounds continued, irregular, too deliberate to be small animals. Something was out there, circling, watching, maybe waiting. I reached for my flashlight, keeping it off at first. I didn't want to announce my presence until I understood what I was dealing with. The beam cut a narrow path through the black, catching glimpses of trees and undergrowth, but nothing more. Then a branch snapped sharply close by, and I could hear the dry scrape of dirt and leaves behind me. My pulse jumped, and I realized I hadn't been as quiet as I thought. Whoever, or whatever, it was knew I was there. The rest of the night passed in fragmented, tense awareness. I could hear the sounds coming closer, then retreating, and the occasional rustle would make me hold my breath until my lungs ached. I thought about running, but the dense forest would quickly disorient me, and I knew I couldn't make it far without revealing my position entirely. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I had no way to measure time. Eventually, as the pre-dawn light began to filter through the trees, the sounds stopped. Complete silence fell. My body relaxed slightly, but I stayed alert. By sunrise, I knew I had to leave the clearing. I packed quickly, keeping low, careful not to disturb the underbrush. As I moved, I noticed signs that confirmed my fears. Flattened grass where something had crouched, large prints in the soft soil that were neither canine nor human, and broken branches at heights that suggested something tall. I didn't stop to study them long, but they followed me in my mind, pressing the realization that I hadn't been alone, and hadn't been by chance. I hiked for hours, staying off any visible paths, trying to avoid confrontation. The forest felt alive in a way that was oppressive, not beautiful, the way it had been when I arrived. Every step was measured, every sound calculated. At one point, I caught movement at the edge of my vision, too large to be a deer, too controlled to be random. I froze, held my breath, and it vanished. My stomach twisted in tension, but I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself that if it wanted to follow, it already knew where I was. By late morning, I reached a small ridge and could see the edge of the forest. Beyond it, open fields and a faint road stretched away. Relief hit me like a wave, but I didn't slow down until I broke into the open. The change in space was sudden, the openness a stark contrast to the confinement of the trees. I paused only briefly to look back, scanning the tree-line, half expecting to see something emerging from the shadows. Nothing appeared. The forest stood silent, impassive. I reached the road and started walking, sticking to the center to remain visible in case someone came along. Cars were rare out here, and it was hours before one appeared. I stopped it, explained where I had been, and finally felt a sense of safety that hadn't existed in those dark hours. Even then, my hands shook, my mind replaying the night endlessly. Later, when I returned home, I documented everything, marking the prints and signs, trying to understand what had stalked me. Experts suggested it might have been a large, unusually bold predator, a mountain lion, perhaps, or a black bear exploring territory. It didn't matter, really. The fear, the realization of vulnerability, had been real. The forest didn't need fairy tales or ghosts to terrify. Its realism, its quiet awareness of my presence was enough. From that trip onward, I never ventured into a forest alone without careful planning. I learned to respect boundaries, to observe signs of wildlife, and to understand that sometimes the most frightening things are not imaginary. They are living, breathing, and patient. They wait in silence and move with intent. That day taught me vigilance and humility, and though I survived, the memory of the night stayed with me, a constant reminder of the fine line between confidence and hubris in the wild. I never saw it again, but the forest never truly let me go. Every time I passed a tree line, I felt that same weight, the same silent awareness, as if it was waiting to see whether I had learned its lesson. The relief of survival was real, and the clarity that came with it lasted far longer than the fear itself. I returned to that wilderness several times after, never alone. Each time I was cautious, deliberate, respectful. I learned to recognize the signs of life beyond my own, the patterns of movement, the subtle indicators that someone, or something, was there. And while the initial terror never fully disappeared, it transformed into a deep, grounded understanding of my place in the world. I learned that fear, carefully observed and respected, could become wisdom. The forest, vast and silent, had taught me that lesson, and it was a gift I carried for the rest of my life. The sun had just slipped behind the horizon when I arrived at the campsite. The forest stretched out around me, thick and dense, with trees so tall they seemed to scrape the last bit of light from the sky. The air was cooler than I had expected, carrying a sharp, earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles. I parked my car on the narrow dirt road, the engine's hum fading into silence as I opened the door. Every small sound, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant call of a bird settling in for the night, felt amplified, almost painfully vivid in the quiet. I pulled on my jacket, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and started down the narrow trail that led to the small clearing where I would set up my tent. The trail was uneven, tangled with roots and rocks, forcing me to watch my step constantly. The forest floor was littered with fallen branches and thick layers of decaying leaves that made my boots sink slightly with each step. As I walked, I noticed small details I wouldn't have cared about in the daylight. The intricate patterns of bark on the trees, the way moss clung to the north side of trunks, the faint smell of wet soil rising from the ground. A breeze rustled the leaves, making the darkness shift and dance, and for a moment, I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks in the fading light, but the feeling lingered like a weight on my chest. When I reached the clearing, I set my pack down and started assembling my tent. The ground was soft, almost spongy, with a thin layer of frost forming in patches, making it slippery. The tent poles felt stiff in my hands, and my fingers stiffened from the cold as I wrestled them into place. The tent finally stood, a small, taut shelter in the midst of towering trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness above. I took a moment to catch my breath, looking around the clearing. Shadows pooled between the trees, and the faint glow of the last sunlight barely reached the ground. The forest was silent now, the initial sounds of birds and small animals giving way to a deeper, heavier quiet, one that made every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sound unnaturally loud. I gathered some firewood from nearby branches, stacking it carefully in a small pile. Most of the wood was damp, covered in moss, but I managed to find enough dry pieces to get a fire going. The first spark caught, and the flame grew steadily, crackling and spitting tiny embers into the cool night air. I sat close to the fire, feeling the warmth spread through my body, listening to the subtle noises of the forest, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I tried to focus on the fire, the small circle of light I had created, but my eyes kept flicking to the darkness beyond. There was a deepening shadow at the edge of the clearing, one that seemed to shift slightly when I looked away. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox, but the shape was too large, too deliberate. I finished setting up my small cooking stove and heated water for a late dinner. The hiss of the boiling water sounded deafening in the stillness, and the smell of instant noodles filled the small clearing, oddly comforting. I ate slowly, keeping my eyes on the treeline, convinced I was imagining things. After dinner, I packed away the stove and moved closer to the fire, stacking a few more pieces of wood to keep it going. Shadows leapt across the clearing as the flames flickered, and I realized I hadn't heard any animals nearby for several minutes. No rustling in the leaves, no scurrying of small feet. The silence was almost oppressive, pressing in from all sides, making it hard to think. After some time, I decided to check the perimeter of the clearing, just to make sure nothing had come too close. I took a flashlight and moved slowly along the edge, the beam cutting through the darkness in a narrow cone. Every snapped twig or rustling leaf made me freeze, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached a dense thicket at the far edge of the clearing and crouched, straining to see into the shadows. The flashlight revealed nothing, only the thick tangle of branches and undergrowth. But then I noticed a pattern in the leaves on the ground, footprints, not like any animal I knew. They were too large, too deep, and spaced in a way that suggested deliberate movement. My stomach twisted, and I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I wasn't alone. I returned to the tent quickly, my flashlight bouncing off the trees as I moved. I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps someone else was camping nearby, though I hadn't passed anyone on the trail. Maybe it was a hiker, or even a hunter, though it was late and the forest was usually empty at this hour. I told myself I was overreacting, that the shadows played tricks on my mind, but the pit in my stomach wouldn't go away. I secured the tent, pulling the zipper tightly and checking the stakes holding it down. The fire still burned steadily in the center of the clearing, casting long, flickering shadows that stretched out into the darkness like fingers. I crawled into my sleeping bag, wrapping myself tightly, and tried to sleep. The sounds of the forest continued, faint and indistinct. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made me tense. Hours passed slowly. At some point, I woke to the sound of heavy breathing just outside the tent. My body went rigid. I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound moved slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, circling the fire, moving with deliberate caution. My mind raced, imagining the worst, an intruder, a wild animal, something I wasn't prepared for. The firelight flickered against the tent walls, and I could see the shadows of the trees dancing across the fabric. I forced myself to breathe slowly, trying to calm the pounding of my heart. When morning finally arrived, the forest looked completely different. The sun cast long beams through the trees, illuminating the frost on the ground and revealing every detail I had missed the night before. The footprints I had noticed were clearer now, leading away from the clearing into the denser parts of the forest. They were human, large boots, and they hadn't been there when I first arrived. My stomach sank as I realized how close someone, or something, had been to me during the night. I packed up the campsite quickly, keeping an eye on the forest edges. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me tense, expecting movement in the shadows. I stuck to the trail on my way back, moving faster than I had on the way in. The forest felt alive in a new way, every sound magnified, every rustle of leaves making me flinch. When I finally reached the dirt road where I had parked my car, relief flooded through me. I didn't stop to look around. I climbed in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The hum of the car was almost deafening in the sudden silence of the forest. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. Back in the safety of my own home, I couldn't shake the memory of the footprints, the heavy breathing, and the shifting shadows of the clearing. I realized that the forest was not just a collection of trees and animals. It was a place where a single misstep, a moment of carelessness, could bring me into contact with something dangerous. I went through every precaution I should have taken, imagining how I might have been better prepared. But I also felt a strange sense of clarity, an understanding of how careful, observant, and respectful one needed to be in such a place. I never returned to that campsite. I never followed the trail again, and I made sure to warn anyone I knew who might venture into similar areas. The memory of that night stayed with me, not as a haunting, but as a reminder that the world could be unexpectedly dangerous, even in places that seemed calm and quiet. I learned to trust my instincts, to be cautious, and to never underestimate the quiet, patient presence of the forest. The fear I felt wasn't thrilling or supernatural. It was real, tangible, and it changed the way I approached the wilderness forever. Even now, years later, when I walk through familiar woods or camp in a safe, designated area, I feel a flicker of that same unease. The knowledge that just beyond the edge of light, in the deep shadows, something unknown could be moving. The lesson of that night stayed with me. Respect the wild, be alert, and never assume safety. It's not fear for fear's sake, but awareness, a careful, deliberate understanding of the world around me, where even a small misstep can have serious consequences. And in that way, I survived not by luck, but by learning to see and respect the danger, even when it was hidden in the dark. The experience shaped the way I approached the outdoors from then on. I invested in better equipment, researched areas before visiting, and never ignored that instinctual sense of being watched or uneasy. I became methodical in setting up campsites, checking the surroundings, noting every detail that could indicate the presence of another person, animal, or hazard. Over time, I could move through the woods with confidence, but the memory of that night remained sharp, a constant reminder of the thin line between calm and danger. I never discovered who, or what, was circling the clearing that night. There was no confrontation, no proof beyond the footprints and the sound of heavy breathing. But the clarity I gained from the experience was profound. I learned that fear, grounded in reality, is a tool, not a weakness. It teaches vigilance, patience, and respect. I survived that night because I stayed observant, cautious, and calm, and those lessons continued to guide me through countless other trips into the wilderness. The forest, once a place of wonder and beauty, became a place of careful observation and respect, a reminder that the world is larger and more complex than we often realize, and that survival depends on attention, preparation, and humility. I still think about that campsite often, not with terror, but with the weight of knowledge. The fear I felt was real, but it taught me something lasting. It showed me that the wilderness has rules we cannot ignore, and that every shadow, every sound, Every